Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're settling into something heavy, something quiet, something that still shapes the world you're falling asleep in right now. We're going back to the 1930s, to the years when America woke up one morning and found that the ground it had been standing on simply wasn't there anymore. This isn't the tidy version you skimmed past in a textbook between bells. This is the slow, textured, lived-in version, the smell of it, the sound of it, the ache of it. Before we drift into that world, a quick word of thanks. So many of you have written in asking for a deep, slow episode on the Great Depression, and tonight is for you. If you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to history rather than static, go ahead and settle in. There's no rush anywhere in this video. If you want to keep this channel going, a like helps more than you'd think. And if you tell me in the comments which city or country you're listening from tonight, I read every single one, usually at some ungodly hour when I should be asleep myself. This show is also available wherever you get your podcasts now, so if your eyes are already heavy, you can just close them and let your ears do the work. Let me ask you something before we begin. Could you build a house out of the things other people threw away? Could you walk 200 miles because a rumor told you there was work at the other end? Could you make dessert out of crackers and sugar and convince your own children it was pie? Could you give away your last dollar to a stranger on your street, knowing you might need it worse than they do? Tonight, you're going to live through a decade that asked those exact questions of 30 million ordinary Americans, and you're going to feel, in a small and gentle way, what it took to answer them. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down low, and let's go back to a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1930 when you wake up before the sun does, mostly because the cold gets in before the light does. Above you is a ceiling made of a flattened kerosene tin, hammered smooth by hand, and if you squint you can still make out the ghost of a brand name stamped into the metal. The wall on your left used to be a road sign. The wall on your right used to be a fence. Together, along with a few boards pulled from a demolished barn, they form the four corners of the only home you have left, and you built every inch of it yourself, over 3 cold weekends, with a borrowed hammer and a great deal of stubbornness. This settlement doesn't appear on any city map. It never will. But everyone who lives here, and everyone who lives just beyond it and looks down their nose at it, calls it by the same nickname, a shantytown named with bitter humor, after the man in the White House who gets blamed for all of it. Your blanket tonight was yesterday's newspaper, 3 layers thick, tucked around your shoulders the way your mother used to tuck a quilt. People here call that a poor man's blanket, and they say it with a small, sad laugh, because laughing is sometimes the only thing left that's free. You don't stand up too quickly. The roof sits low, propped on salvaged beams that groan if you move too fast, and more than one of your neighbors has a fresh bruise on the forehead to prove what happens when you forget. The floor beneath you is packed dirt, swept every morning out of habit rather than necessity, because dirt doesn't really get dirtier. In the corner sits a stove made from a repurposed oil drum, its metal side still holding a whisper of warmth from the fire you kept going as long as you could last night. There's an odd kind of pride that lives in a place like this, one that surprises people who have never had to feel it. You built this with your own 2 hands. Nobody handed it to you. Nobody's charity put a roof over your head. And there's something in that, small, stubborn, and entirely yours, that the bank could never repossess. Outside, the settlement is stirring. Thin ropes of smoke rise from a dozen makeshift chimneys, each one just a length of stovepipe angled toward the sky. Somewhere, a baby is crying. Somewhere else, a rooster that clearly hasn't been informed about the actual time crows with total confidence. And somewhere close by, a man is coughing in that particular way that makes everyone around him go quiet and look at the ground. Your neighbors are not what the well-dressed folks downtown whisper about at dinner parties. They are not lazy, and they are not criminals, and they are not looking for a handout for the fun of it. The man, too, shacks over used to manage the shoe department at a proud downtown store. Now he shares a wall made from a coffee advertisement with a family of 6. The woman who boils water for the whole row every morning used to teach 3rd grade arithmetic. This is not a camp of drifters. This is a camp of people who did everything they were told to do, Work hard, save carefully, stay honest, and watched it all get pulled out from under them anyway. There's no running water here, so you fetch it from a shared pump 2 streets over, and the matter of a bathroom is one best left to the imagination and to a length of canvas strung up for privacy. When it rains, the paths between the shacks turn into a thick, grasping mud that swallows boots whole, and everything you own starts to smell faintly of a cellar that gave up trying. Summer turns your tin walls into something close to an oven. Winter turns them into something close to a refrigerator, and you learn to sleep in your coat, your socks, and anything else you can layer onto your body before the cold really settles in. And yet, and this is the part that surprises outsiders every time, there is order here. There are rules, mostly unspoken, and they are followed with a kind of quiet ceremony. People sweep their little patch of dirt each morning. Some settlements even elect an informal mayor, a man everyone trusts to settle disputes and keep the peace, because when the city has abandoned you, you learn to govern yourselves. There's a dignity in the way a woman washes her one good blouse in a bucket and hangs it carefully to dry, insisting on looking presentable in a place built entirely out of things nobody else wanted. You start to understand, living here, that poverty and self-respect are not opposites at all. A man can lose his house, his savings, and his job, and still fold his blanket into a neat square every single morning, because that square fold is one small thing the world hasn't managed to take from him yet. So you lace up your boots, the same boots you used as a pillow last night, and you step out into a morning thick with wood smoke. There's a long day of hunting for work ahead of you, work that, if you're honest with yourself, probably doesn't exist. But before any of that, like everyone else in this cardboard kingdom, you need something to eat, and that means finding the line. It's barely light out. And you're already standing in it, a line of men and women stretching around 3 full city blocks. This is the bread line, and for most of the people standing in it, it's the only guaranteed meal of the day. Somewhere up ahead, a church group, a charity, or occasionally a local businessman looking for some good publicity, is ladling out a thin broth and handing over a small heel of bread to anyone patient enough to wait their turn. There's no menu here. There's no substitution. And there is absolutely no complaining, because half the men standing in this line were running their own businesses 18 months ago, and pride has quietly become a luxury none of them can afford anymore. The soup, when you finally get it, is watery and mostly flavored by memory. The bread is a day or two past its best, and still, you are quietly, deeply grateful for both. The line inches forward at what feels like the pace of cold syrup, and you have more than enough time to study the coats of the men standing ahead of you, most of them worn thin at the elbows and carefully patched with whatever scrap of fabric was on hand. Nobody talks much in this line. There's an unspoken understanding that everyone's story rhymes with everyone else's story, and hearing it said out loud doesn't make the wait go any faster. It just makes the cold feel colder. You shift your weight foot to foot, blow into your cupped hands, and watch your own breath hang there in front of you like a small, pale ghost of the warmth you used to take completely for granted. It's a little like waiting outside a restaurant that never seems to open, except the wait is measured in hours. The food is a surprise, and if you step out of line even for a moment, your spot is gone for good. The volunteers running these lines have seen every trick in the book by now, so there's no cutting in, no saving a spot for 6 cousins, no charming your way to the front. You earn your bowl of soup one slow, patient step at a time, and in some cities the lines stretch on for thousands of people a day, a river of hunger flowing quietly through streets that used to hum with the sound of streetcars and cash registers. What's strangest about the line is exactly who you find standing in it. There's a man in a suit that was clearly expensive once, its cut still sharp even as the fabric has gone thin and shiny at the seams. There's a fellow still wearing a pair of fine leather shoes from better days, now cracked at the sole and stuffed with cardboard to keep the wet out. The Depression didn't politely limit itself to people who were already struggling. It reached up and pulled down bankers and engineers and department store owners, and deposited every one of them into the exact same slow-moving line for the exact same thin bowl of soup. Rich or poor a year ago, everyone's stomach now speaks the same language. When you finally reach the front, a tired volunteer fills your bowl without much ceremony and hands over your small piece of bread. You find a spot along the wall and eat slowly, stretching it out, because you don't know for certain when your next meal is coming. Around you, hundreds of others are doing exactly the same thing, a quiet congregation bound together by need rather than faith. There's no real shame in it, not anymore, but there is a heaviness in the air, the weight of grown adults who worked hard their entire lives now depending on the kindness of people they've never met. You finish, wipe the bowl clean with your last bit of bread, and hand it back. The line behind you is still just as long, still snaking around the corner, endless. There's nowhere left to go now but out into the day, chasing whatever slim hope of work still exists out there. And for a great many men in 1931, that hope means leaving town altogether, chasing rumors down along the railroad tracks. The freight train business is a very bad idea that roughly 2 million Americans are trying anyway this year, and this morning you're going to be one of them. Your town is out of work, truly out of it, not a little slow, not temporarily quiet, but genuinely empty of anything resembling a job. So you do what so many others in your position are doing. You go looking for work somewhere else, and your only ticket there is a moving freight train that isn't selling tickets at all. This practice has a name, riding the rails, and it is exactly as reckless as it sounds when you say it out loud. You crouch low in the weeds beside the tracks before dawn, watching the rhythm of the wheels, waiting for a boxcar rolling just slow enough to catch without killing you. Then you run, you grab, and you pray, in roughly that order, and if your timing is off even slightly, you can lose a leg or worse in the space of a single breath. Inside the car, once you're aboard, it's dark and cold and already crowded with other hopeful strangers, all of you heading towards some town you've only heard about secondhand, chasing a rumor that may or may not be true. There's no dining car. There's no conductor checking on your comfort. There's no schedule that has any interest in whether you survive the trip or not. Just wind and wheels, and the thin, stubborn hope that the next stop has work waiting. Catching a moving train is something you learn only under pressure, with absolutely no room for a second attempt. You want the train slow enough to grab hold of, but fast enough that it's actually leaving the yard rather than simply idling. You reach for the ladder or the lip of an open door, plant your feet, and haul yourself upward while the gravel rushes past just beneath your dangling boots. Miss your grip, and the very train that promised you a future can just as easily become the thing that ends it. The old hands who have been riding for years have a grim name for the worst possible outcome, and every single one of them has seen it happen to somebody, or heard the story secondhand from someone who did. Once you're safely aboard, comfort is nowhere on the itinerary. In the heat of summer, the metal boxcar bakes you slowly, like a potato left too long in the coals. In the depths of winter, that same car becomes a rolling icebox, and there are men who have frozen to death riding through mountain passes at night, found stiff and silent when the train finally stopped. You brace yourself into a corner, share whatever scraps of food anyone still has left, and try to sleep to the endless clack of wheels on rail joints. It's a little like the worst overnight bus ride imaginable, except it's free, it's illegal, and it is, on occasion, fatal. Since you're not paying for a seat, you learn quickly that you have no grounds whatsoever to complain about the accommodations, which is convenient, because there's nobody around to complain to anyway. Then there are the railroad police, the men everyone calls bulls, whose entire job is finding people exactly like you and removing them from the train, often with real enthusiasm for the work. When your train finally rolls into a yard, you need to know in advance whether the bulls working that yard are the kind who look the other way, or the kind who crack skulls first and ask questions never. Getting caught can mean a beating in a dark corner of the yard, a night in a cold cell, or simply being thrown from the moving train, sometimes before it has even fully stopped. So you learn, town by town, which yards are safe and which ones aren't, and you jump clear before the train has properly arrived, slipping into the shadows like you were never there at all. The riders themselves are a strange cross-section of the entire country, shrunk down into a single boxcar. There are grown men who lost farms and factory jobs within the same terrible year. There are teenage boys who left home quietly so their families would have one less mouth to feed at supper. And there is a surprising number of women too, dressed in borrowed trousers and caps, blending in as best they can to stay safe on a road built for men. Everyone chasing the same whispered rumor that there's work in the next state over, in the orchards, in the mills, anywhere at all but here. Most of those rumors turn out to be exactly that, rumors, nothing more, and so you ride from town to town, your stomach empty and your eyes scanning the horizon for an opportunity that never quite seems to appear. It is exhausting in a way that settles deep into your bones, dangerous in a way that never fully leaves your nerves, and lonely in a way that surprises you even though you expected it. But when you finally swing down near a rail yard on the outskirts of some unfamiliar town, you discover you're not entirely alone after all. Down along the tracks, a small camp of fellow travelers is already waiting, complete with a pot bubbling over a low fire and a secret language scratched into the fence posts nearby. Let's go warm ourselves at their fire for a while. The train slows as it nears the yard, and you tumble down into what everyone calls a hobo jungle, which, despite the name, is simply a camp, not an actual jungle, though the smell wandering through it is genuinely up for debate. This is where the wandering unemployed gather to cook, to rest, and to trade rumors about which towns have work and which ones have a sheriff who despises strangers on sight. Somebody already has a pot of what they call mulligan stew simmering away, built from whatever every traveler tossed in on arrival, and you add your one lonely potato to the pot like it's a treasured contribution to a grand feast. Scratched quietly into the nearby fence posts and door frames is a whole secret alphabet of chalk marks, a code that tells the next traveler through which house has a kind woman inside, which one has a mean dog waiting in the yard, and which one will simply call the police the moment you knock. It's the original review system, written straight into the dirt. The jungle usually sits just close enough to the rail yard to let you catch the next outbound train quickly, but far enough away to stay out of easy reach of the bulls patrolling the tracks. It's a loose, shifting gathering of men and boys clustered around a fire, some passing through for just an hour or two, others settled in for several days while they wait for the right train or the right piece of news. There's a rough order to the place, an unwritten set of manners that everyone follows because out here, survival genuinely depends on it. You keep the camp clean. You share whatever you have, no matter how little that is. You leave the cooking pots and utensils behind for the next traveler, tucked away carefully where they can be found. Break these unwritten rules and word travels through the network of jungles faster than any train, because out here, your reputation is very nearly the only thing you still truly own. That pot of mulligan stew simmering over the fire is a small daily miracle of teamwork. No single person in this camp has enough food to make a proper meal on their own, but between all of you together, there's suddenly quite a lot. One man contributes a handful of carrots lifted quietly from a nearby field. Another adds a bit of meat whose exact origin nobody thinks it wise to ask about too closely. Someone else tosses in an onion, and you offer up your lonely potato, and stirred together in a battered tin can over the open flame. It slowly becomes dinner for a dozen strangers who, an hour ago, had never met. It's a potluck thrown by people who have almost nothing to pot and even less luck to speak of, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, it works. The stew tastes like smoke and dirt, and somewhere underneath all of that, genuine generosity. On a truly empty stomach, it might be the finest thing you've eaten in weeks. The chalk code scratched onto the fence posts is where this whole hidden world gets genuinely clever. Since these travelers have no way to post a review or mail a letter ahead to warn the next man, they've built an entire visual language of symbols to guide whoever follows behind them. One particular mark might mean a kind woman lives at this house and will feed a hungry stranger without asking too many questions. Another warns of a vicious dog, or an angry man with a shotgun, or a sheriff who doesn't take kindly to visitors passing through his town. A certain shape scratched into the wood means it's safe to make camp nearby for the night. Another means the water from this well is safe to drink. It's not so different from leaving a star rating for an entire town, scratched quietly and anonymously onto a fence post, a small act of solidarity passed between people who will very likely never meet each other face to face. There's a whole culture out here too, complete with its own vocabulary and its own quiet code of honor. The men are careful to draw a distinction between themselves. A hobo, they'll tell you, is someone who travels and works. A tramp travels but avoids work wherever he can. A bum does neither. The distinction matters enormously to the men who make it, because it means they still think of themselves as workers at heart, still men with pride intact, simply men the country has, for the moment, run entirely out of jobs for. Around the fire at night, they trade stories, sing half-remembered songs, and dream out loud about a mythical land somewhere down the line where the hens supposedly lay soft-boiled eggs already cooked, and nobody ever has to lift a finger to work again. You warm your hands by the flame, fill your stomach as best you can, and for one evening at least, feel a little less alone in a very large and increasingly unfriendly country. But the jungle is only ever a resting stop, never a destination in itself. Tomorrow morning you'll be hopping another train, chasing the same thin rumor of work down another stretch of track. Meanwhile, far away from the rail yards, out where the farmland used to feed half the nation, an entirely different kind of disaster is quietly building on the horizon, one made of nothing but wind and dust, and a very particular kind of despair. Let's head out to the plains and see it coming out on the southern plains. Morning has started looking wrong lately. The horizon carries a rolling black wall, taller than any building you've ever stood beneath, and it moves toward the farmhouse the way the end of the world might move if it were running just slightly late for an appointment. This is what people out here have started calling a black blizzard, a storm made not of snow, but of the very topsoil that used to grow your family's wheat, now torn loose and thrown into the furious air. Years of overplowing, stripping away the tough native grasses that once held everything together, combined with a brutal, relentless drought, have left the land bare and defenseless, and now the ground itself is simply leaving. You bolt for the house, stuff wet rags beneath every door, and still the dust finds its way through every crack it can locate. By the time the storm finally passes, your kitchen table wears a thin gray blanket of dirt, and you understand, in a way you never fully did before, that out here, even the earth itself has apparently given up. You saw this one coming from miles away, which somehow makes the whole experience worse rather than better. The wall of dust builds slowly along the horizon and then rolls toward you with an eerie silence at first, followed by a low growl as it swallows the sun whole. Birds fly ahead of the storm in a visible panic. The temperature drops sharply and without warning. Static electricity crackles so strongly through the dry air that touching a metal fence or shaking a neighbor's hand can send a visible spark leaping between you. Some families have taken to dragging a chain from the back of their car just to ground the static charge before it builds too high. The whole sky shifts gradually from blue to a sickly brown to a deep, churning black, and then the day simply ends, right there in the middle of the afternoon, as though someone reached up and switched off the sun. When the storm actually hits, the world outside simply disappears. You cannot see your own hand held directly in front of your face. People have been known to get lost walking from the barn to the house, a distance of perhaps a few dozen steps that they've walked 10,000 times before, and some of them never make it back. The dust itself is so fine that it behaves almost like water, pouring through the smallest gap, sifting silently under doors and around window frames no matter how carefully you've sealed them. Inside, you light a lamp at noon, and it barely manages to glow through the haze filling the room. You breathe through a damp cloth pressed to your face and simply wait, listening to the wind outside scour the paint clean off the side of your own house. It's a little like a snowstorm pulled straight out of a nightmare, Except the snow in this version is the very ground you've been standing on your whole life, and it never, ever melts away. When the storm finally passes, the cleanup begins, and there is genuinely no end to it. Dust piles up against the fence lines in drifts that look uncannily like brown snow. It buries fence posts entirely, half covers parked tractors, and sneaks its way into absolutely everything you own. Your mother sweeps and shovels and sweeps again, fighting a war she cannot possibly win, because the next storm is already quietly forming somewhere out to the west. Grit in your food becomes simply normal. You learn to set the dinner table with the plates turned face down until the very moment you're ready to eat, just to keep the worst of the dust off your supper. How did it come to this exactly? For years, farmers plowed up the tough, deep-rooted native grasses that had always held this soil firmly in place, planting wheat as far as the eye could see while prices were high, and the rain still came steadily each season. Then, quite simply, the rain stopped coming. The drought arrived and refused to leave. The crops withered in the fields, and the exposed soil, no longer anchored by any living root system, dried slowly into a fine, loose powder. Without the grass to hold on to, the land had nothing left to grip the wind with. So when the storms swept in across the open plains, they simply picked the earth straight up and carried it away, sometimes for hundreds of miles, darkening the skies over distant cities and dusting ships that were sailing far out at sea. You stand in your ruined kitchen, dirt caught between your teeth and grief sitting heavy in your chest, and you look out at fields that are not going to grow a single thing this year. The land your family bet absolutely everything on has, it seems, quietly turned against you. But the storms don't stop at simply burying your crops and your hope for the season. They get into your lungs too, quietly, with every single breath you take, and that particular danger moves slower, and it is, in its own way, far more frightening. Let's talk for a moment about what all that dust does once it's settled deep inside you. When the dust finally settles outside, the real danger for your family is only just beginning, because you've already been breathing it steadily for hours on end. Fine grit works its way into your lungs, into your eyes, into your food, and into your sleep at night. Doctors working out on the plains have started seeing a grim new illness they've taken to calling dust pneumonia, and it strikes hardest at the very young and the very old, exactly the people least equipped to fight it off. Mothers hang wet sheets over the windows and press damp cloths to their children's faces, doing everything within their power with almost nothing available to work with. There's very little medicine to be had out here, and even less money to pay for what does exist. So mostly there is simply waiting, and hopping, and a quiet kind of suffering that never quite makes it into any newspaper, because out here, it has simply become part of daily living. This dust isn't like ordinary dirt tracked in on a boot. It's been ground so fine by the relentless wind that it hangs suspended in the air long after any given storm has technically passed, a haze you can genuinely taste on your tongue. It slips past every natural defense your body has built up, settling deep in your chest where it was never meant to be. You cough, and the cough simply doesn't go away. It lingers for days, sometimes for weeks, a dry, hacking cough that scrapes your throat raw with every repetition. When you finally do spit, what comes up is dark, and you try very hard not to think too closely about the fact that it is, quite literally, the very soil that used to be your family's livelihood, now lodged somewhere inside your own body. For the sick life narrows down quickly to nothing but the struggle to breathe. The smallest children are the most vulnerable of all, their tiny lungs simply no match for the endless grit in the air. A family might do absolutely everything correctly, sealing the house as tightly as possible, filtering the air through wet rags hung over every window, keeping the children as still and calm as they can manage, and the dust still finds a way in regardless. Out here, the nearest doctor might be 20 miles away down roads that are sometimes buried entirely under drifted dust, and even if you somehow manage to reach him, there is often frustratingly little he can actually do. This is an age that comes well before the medicines we take completely for granted today. So treatment, more often than not, comes down to comfort, patience, and quiet prayer whispered over a cot in a darkened room. Try, for a moment, to imagine trying to protect your own family from an enemy you simply cannot lock out of the house. An intruder that walks straight through solid walls as though they aren't even there. That is precisely what the mothers of the plains face every single day, without exception. They wet the sheets and hang them carefully over every window, and by the following morning those same sheets are already caked brown with grit. They serve food covered right up until the very last second before it's eaten, and it still crunches faintly between the teeth. They wipe down every surface in the house, and within an hour a new film has already begun to settle back over everything. It's an exhausting, largely thankless battle fought against something that genuinely never stops coming, waged with nothing but the meager weapons of soap, water, and sheer stubborn love for their children. The strangest part of it all, perhaps, is how ordinary the danger gradually becomes. When something threatens your family every single day for years on end, you eventually stop treating it as an emergency and start treating it instead as simply the weather, which, in a very real sense, it has become. People go about their daily business between storms, tending to what little they still can, because life stubbornly refuses to pause simply because the air itself seems determined to slowly kill you. Children still walk to school when the roads allow it, cloths tied carefully over their mouths and noses. Chores still get done, storm or no storm. The sheer human capacity to adjust to the unbearable is remarkable to witness, and more than a little heartbreaking, and out here on the plains, it is on constant, full display. Still, the toll is entirely real, measured out in small graves scattered across the plains and in the deep, rattling coughs that follow the survivors for the rest of their natural lives. The dust takes what it takes, and the families who choose to stay simply learn somehow to endure it, because leaving would mean walking away from absolutely everything they've ever built with their own hands. Not every family loses their farm to the sky, though. Plenty of others are losing everything they own to something far more human, and in its own quiet way, just as merciless. It arrives wearing a suit and a friendly smile, and it lives in a tidy brick building right there on Main Street. Let's talk now about the day the bank simply stops giving your own money back to you. Word moves through a small town like a grass fire on a dry day. The bank might be in trouble, someone says, and within the hour, half the county is sprinting toward Main Street to pull their savings out before the doors close for good. You join the rush yourself, heart pounding hard in your chest, clutching your little bank passbook the way a man might clutch a winning lottery ticket. The trouble is that banks never actually keep the full sum of everyone's money, sitting quietly in a vault somewhere. So the moment enough frightened depositors show up all at once demanding their cash back, the entire fragile system simply collapses under its own weight. Thousands of banks fail this way across the country, one after another, and there is no safety net anywhere to catch the deposits as they vanish. No insurance policy. No reassuring phone call promising it will all work out fine in the end. If you reach the teller's window too late, your entire life savings simply cease to exist. Gone, just like that. Have a nice day. The rumor itself is really all it takes to set the whole thing in motion. Maybe someone heard the bank made a string of bad loans. Maybe a large depositor quietly pulled their money out first. Maybe it's simply fear feeding hungrily on more fear, with no solid facts behind it at all. It hardly matters in the end whether the original rumor was even true, because the panic itself quickly becomes the actual disaster. The moment enough people start to believe the bank might fail, they all rush at once to withdraw their money, and that very rush is precisely what makes the bank fail for real. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and your entire family's future happens to be riding on which side of it you land. A stampede in which the slowest to arrive at the door get absolutely nothing at all. Here's the part of it that feels like a genuinely cruel trick, once you finally understand how it actually works. When you deposit your money at the bank doesn't tuck your specific dollars away into a little labeled box somewhere with your name written on it. It lends the great majority of that money back out to other borrowers, keeping only a small fraction on hand to cover the ordinary day-to-day withdrawals. This system works perfectly well, for years and years, as long as everyone stays calm, and only a handful of people want their cash back on any given afternoon. But the very instant a crowd shows up all at once, the bank simply doesn't have anywhere near enough physical currency sitting in the building to pay everybody who's standing in line. The money is entirely real. It hasn't vanished into thin air exactly. It's simply out there in the world already, loaned out to other people, and not sitting in the vault waiting for you. So you stand there in the crowd outside on Main Street, watching the heavy doors, and the mood around you turns ugly fast. People are shouting. People are pushing. People are waving their passbooks over their heads like tickets to a show that's already sold out. The teller pays out the first arrivals in trembling stacks of bills, and you can watch, in real time, the pile of cash behind the counter visibly shrinking with every single transaction. Everyone standing there seems to be doing the same grim arithmetic in their heads at once. There are perhaps 300 people crowded outside, and enough cash inside for maybe 50 of them at most. Then the bank officer steps out from behind the counter, pale and visibly sweating, and announces that the bank is closing its doors, effective immediately. And the sound that rises up from the crowd in response is something caught halfway between a groan and a scream. It's a little like a game of musical chairs where the chairs themselves happen to be your rent money, your grocery money, and your children's next pair of shoes. And when the music finally stops, there are almost no chairs left standing at all. The people who manage to get their money out in time clutch it tightly and hurry home without looking back. The people who didn't make it in time are left standing out in the street, holding a worthless little book that records a balance they will, in all likelihood, never actually see again. Farms, small businesses, and entire nest eggs built carefully over a full lifetime of careful, disciplined saving simply vanish over the course of a single afternoon. Not because anyone stole them outright exactly, but because the whole fragile system of mutual trust it was all built on has simply come undone at once. And there's no one left to appeal to about it, no insurance claim to file, no government promise anywhere that's going to make you whole again. The money is gone, and that, unfortunately, is the entire end of the story. Thousands of banks across the nation collapsed this exact way over the course of the decade, dragging untold savings down with them into ruin, and teaching an entire generation to hide their remaining cash in coffee cans and mattress linings instead of ever trusting a bank again. So now you are broke. Truly, genuinely broke, and you still, somehow, need to eat, and you still need to find some way to pay the rent that's coming due. That means finding some way, any way at all, to earn a few honest pennies. For a great many people in exactly your position, the answer turns out to be a simple wooden crate set up on a street corner. Let's go sell some apples together. With the bank gone and the factory shuttered behind you, you need some kind of income, any kind at all, and quickly. So you become, almost overnight, an apple seller. Growers sitting on more fruit than they could possibly sell have started handing out crates on simple credit to anyone willing to try selling them. And now, seemingly overnight, every street corner in America has a man in a once fine suit carefully stacking apples into neat little pyramids. You sell each one for 5 cents, which sounds perfectly reasonable right up, until you notice that the fellow standing 20 feet away is selling the exact same apples at the exact same price to the exact same 3 people walking past. It isn't really a business at all, not in any true sense. It's simply a proud man's way of not begging outright, standing out in the cold for 10 hours straight to earn just barely enough for a modest supper, tipping his hat politely and smiling as though this were all perfectly ordinary. The arrangement seemed clever enough when someone first thought of it. The apple growers had far more fruit on hand than they could ever hope to sell through normal channels, and the cities, meanwhile, were absolutely full of idle men with nothing to do and no way to earn a living. So somebody hit on the idea of simply putting the two problems together and hoping they might cancel each other out. You take a crate of apples on credit, wheel it over to a busy corner, and sell them off one by one, paying the grower back out of your earnings and keeping whatever small difference remains for yourself. On paper, it looks like a genuinely tidy little solution to two separate problems at once. In practice, It means the sidewalks of every major city fill up with thousands upon thousands of apple sellers, all offering an identical product at an identical price, all hoping that the same small handful of passers-by happen to have a spare nickel in their pocket that particular morning. You learn quickly, standing out there in the cold, that location is absolutely everything, and that all the truly good locations were claimed a long time before you ever arrived. The corner just outside the busy office building downtown, the spot right by the train station where commuters pass by twice a day, the stretch of sidewalk near the theater where people feel just a little more generous on their way in to see a show. Every single one of these prime pieces of pavement already has a man standing on it, sometimes two, eyeing any newcomer with the wary suspicion of a rival shark circling the same stretch of water. So you settle for a lesser corner instead, and you make your small pyramid of apples as appealing as you possibly can, polishing each one carefully against your sleeve until it catches the light. Then you wait, and you wait some more. The wind cuts straight through your coat, your feet slowly go numb inside your worn-out shoes, and you tip your hat to absolutely everyone who passes, most of whom look away deliberately, because they are nearly as broke as you are and can't bear to meet your eye. It's a little like an entire city deciding, on the very same morning, to open up the exact same shop selling the exact same product, and then everyone standing around afterward wondering out loud why nobody seems to be turning any kind of profit. The competition out here is genuinely absurd, and every single seller standing on every single corner knows it perfectly well. And yet the corners stay full anyway, every single day, because the only alternative on offer is worse still. Selling apples was never really about the apples themselves, not fundamentally. It's about standing on your own 2 feet in front of the whole world. It's about being able to say, honestly, that you are working, rather than simply holding out your hat and asking for charity outright. There's a meaningful difference in your own mind, at the very least, between a man selling fruit on a corner and a man begging for coins, even if the day's actual earnings come out to almost exactly the same amount either way. The customers, when they finally do come, turn out to be a genuinely mixed bunch. Some buy an apple they never really wanted in the first place, simply because they can't quite bring themselves to walk past your hopeful, waiting face without doing something. Some haggle hard over a single cent as though their entire livelihood depends on it, and for some of them, quite honestly, it very well might. Some ignore you completely, hurrying past with their eyes fixed firmly on some middle distance, and you find after a while that you can't really blame them for it either. You're just one apple seller among an entire army of apple sellers, one small figure in a worn suit standing quietly amid a strange, sad landscape that has somehow become the new ordinary face of the American city. At the end of each long day, you count out your pennies carefully, pay the grower back what you owe him, and carry home whatever thin profit still remains, along with a few bruised apples that nobody wanted to buy. It isn't nearly enough, not really, but it is something, and out here, something reliably beats nothing at all when your family is sitting at home waiting for you to walk through the door. And speaking of your family waiting for you at home, there is the small, ever-present matter of actually feeding them each night. When your entire family fortune amounts to a pocketful of loose change and a couple of soft, bruised apples, putting dinner on the table requires a certain kind of stubborn creativity. Let's see what's bubbling away in the pot tonight. Dinner this evening is a local specialty that people have taken, with a certain grim humor, to calling Hoover stew. Named once again in loving dishonor of the man in the White House, everyone still blames for their troubles. The recipe itself is remarkably simple, mostly because the available ingredients amount to almost nothing at all. Into the pot goes a modest handful of macaroni, a single can of beans, a few thin slices of hot dog if the week happened to be a slightly kinder one, and enough plain water to stretch the whole mixture across every hungry mouth waiting at the table. It's thin, it's bland, and it reappears on the table with an unsettling regularity that would test the patience of a saint. Nobody in the family really pretends to enjoy it anymore, but everybody eats it anyway, because the alternative is going to bed with a stomach that growls louder than the freight trains rumbling past outside. You learn quickly, in a household like this one, that flavor is entirely optional, but calories most certainly are not. The name itself is a bitter little private joke, the very same joke stamped onto so much else during this long decade. The president's name gets attached to almost everything miserable, from the shantytowns to the newspaper blankets to the empty trouser pockets people turn inside out and call Hoover flags. It isn't entirely fair to the man personally, not really, but fairness was never really the point of the joke in the first place. Blaming him by name is simply a way of blaming the whole broken situation at once, and nomming your own sad supper after him is a way of laughing at the entire mess, however grimly, rather than simply crying about it every single night. So Hoover stew gets served up, night after night, in kitchens scattered right across the country. Making it is really less a matter of cooking than of careful assembly. You start with plain water, because water is free and it makes everything else in the pot go that much further. Then you add whatever cheap, filling ingredients you happen to have on hand. Macaroni is a particular favorite in most households because it's inexpensive, and it swells up satisfyingly once it hits the hot water in the pot. A single can of beans adds a bit of real substance, along with a welcome bit of protein. If there happens to be a little extra money that particular week, a few hot dogs get sliced thin and scattered through the mixture, functioning less as an actual ingredient than as a kind of rumor of meat drifting through the broth. Some households manage to throw in canned tomatoes, or corn, or whatever other vegetables can be scraped together from the bottom of the pantry. There are no fixed measurements, and there are no real rules to follow, only the single overriding goal of turning very little food into just barely enough for everyone. The end result is never going to win any culinary awards, and everyone at the table knows it perfectly well. It's a pale, starchy, faintly salty sort of mush that fills the belly without ever once exciting the tongue. It's the kind of meal you eat with your mind wandering somewhere else entirely, spooning it down out of sheer necessity rather than anything resembling actual pleasure. And the truly hardest part of it all is the sheer repetition. When this is genuinely all your family can afford, this is what you eat tonight, and again tomorrow night, and again the night after that, on, until the very sight of macaroni sitting in the pantry makes you sigh out loud without even meaning to. Try, for just a moment, to imagine eating the exact same joyless casserole every single evening for an entire year, and you begin to understand something of the quiet, grinding monotony of a Depression-era family dinner. But don't mistake all that blandness for failure, not for a moment. Because this humble little stew is doing genuinely important work at that table every single night. It's stretching a few scattered cents into a real meal for an entire family. It's keeping the children fed when there is quite literally nothing else in the house to feed them. It's the difference, plain and simple, between hunger and something that at least resembles fullness. And in these particular years, that difference is genuinely everything a family has left to hold on to. There's a real, quiet ingenuity buried inside it too, a whole unofficial domestic science built around making one single can of beans do the work of an entire proper dinner. Mothers across the country become true experts in this exhausting arithmetic of survival, calculating calories and pennies together with something approaching the precision of a trained engineer. So you eat your bowl of Hoover stew, and you are honestly glad to have it in front of you, even as some quiet part of you still dreams of the roasts and pies of better days gone by. You clean your bowl completely, scraping it right down to the last smear, because wasting even a single spoonful has become, in this household, simply unthinkable. When the pot finally sits empty on the stove, that's that, until tomorrow evening rolls around and the whole quiet ritual begins again. Of course, a family cannot survive on beans and quiet gloom alone, not forever, and every now and then a household finds itself craving just a little sweetness, a small, stolen taste of the good life everyone still half remembers. The trouble, naturally, is affording it, or in some households, simply learning how to convincingly fake it instead. Let's bake a pie tonight out of almost nothing at all. Sometimes a family simply needs a little joy in the evening, so tonight, you decide to bake a pie. There's just one fairly significant problem standing in your way. You don't actually have any apples on hand. In fact, you don't have most things a normal pie recipe would call for. So instead, you reach for the great culinary illusion of the entire era, the mock apple pie, built almost entirely out of broken soda crackers, ordinary sugar, and a generous, hopeful splash of cinnamon. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, it tastes vaguely, unmistakably like the real thing, or at least close enough to convincingly fool a tired tongue at the end of a genuinely hard day. The whole decade, in a sense, runs quietly on exactly these kinds of cheerful little lies. There's fake apple pie made from crackers. There's coffee stretched thin with roasted chicory root. There's soup that's really mostly just ketchup and warm water dressed up with a little seasoning. You aren't really cooking, not in the traditional sense of the word. You're performing a kind of very convincing food magic, night after night, for an audience that desperately wants to believe the trick. The mock apple pie stands as the genuine crown jewel of this whole quiet deception, and it really is remarkable that it works at all. You take plain crackers, break them carefully into pieces, and arrange them inside a pie crust exactly where the sliced apples would ordinarily go. Then you make a simple syrup out of sugar, water, and a bit of cream of tartar, boil it up with a generous dose of cinnamon, and pour the whole mixture over the waiting crackers. Into the oven it goes, and when it finally comes back out, something close to genuine magic has happened inside that dish. The crackers have softened and soaked up the spice syrup, taking on a texture and a flavor that is uncannily, almost eerily close to real baked apples. Serve it warm at the table, and half the family genuinely cannot tell the difference. The other half, quite honestly, is simply too polite to mention it out loud. It's a little like a magic trick performed entirely in the kitchen, a sleight of hand carried out with nothing more than a rolling pin, and it is far from the only trick in the household's growing repertoire. When coffee grows too expensive to buy in any real quantity, you stretch what little you have left by mixing in roasted chicory root, or ground grains, or really whatever happens to be on hand that adds a bit of color and bitterness to the cup. When you want something warm and hearty and you have almost nothing at all in the pantry, you might make a thin soup out of hot water, a good squirt of ketchup, and whatever seasoning happens to be within easy reach. A thin red broth that at least tastes like it's genuinely trying its best. Butter gets carefully stretched further with a bit of milk. Milk itself gets quietly watered down, and leftovers get reinvented so many times over the course of a week that they eventually lose all memory of what they originally were. Every single one of these small tricks amounts to a quiet act of defiance, a flat refusal to let poverty strip away absolutely every last small pleasure a family has left. The mock apple pie isn't really about dessert at all, not fundamentally. It's about a mother wanting, more than almost anything else, to give her children a small treat, one genuine moment of sweetness in a life that currently offers precious few of them. It's about keeping up some sense of normalcy, some flicker of celebration, some feeling of home, even while the wider world outside has gone thoroughly grim and gray. There is real love baked into that crust, sitting right alongside the crushed crackers, and everyone gathered around the table feels it quietly, even if nobody actually says so out loud. The strange thing about it all is just how well these small illusions genuinely hold up under scrutiny. Taste, it turns out, is really far more than simple chemistry. It's memory and expectation and mood all working together at once. And a hungry family that genuinely wants to believe they're eating real apple pie will, to a surprising and moving degree, actually end up tasting apple pie. The mind fills in generously whatever the pantry simply cannot provide on its own. In this particular way, the whole decade becomes a long, quiet exercise in finding the shape of comfort even when the actual substance behind it is missing. In convincing yourself, night after night, that warm water and a little ketchup really and truly amounts to soup. So you serve up your mock apple pie at the table, and you watch your family genuinely enjoy every bite of it, and you feel a small flicker of real triumph rise up over the hard times pressing in from every side. You made something out of almost nothing at all, and for one single evening, the table feels just a little richer than it has any honest right to feel. These small victories add up quietly, one clever substitution at a time, night after night, week after week. And speaking of clever substitutions, that same stubborn spirit of making do reaches far beyond the kitchen and stretches all the way to the very clothes on your back, which, if you look closely enough, might well have started their life holding 20 pounds of flour at the general store. Let's talk for a moment about wearing your own grocery bag to church. Your new dress is genuinely beautiful, covered in cheerful little flowers, and until fairly recently, it was a plain cotton sack that held 20 pounds of self-rising flour on a store shelf. Manufacturers eventually noticed that thrifty households across the country were quietly sewing clothes out of empty feed and flour sacks, and so, ever practical, they started printing the plain cotton in cheerful patterns, turning ordinary grocery packaging into an entire quiet fashion supply chain almost overnight. Now your mother picks which brand of flour to buy based largely on which particular print she wants for your next school outfit. A single dress might require 3 matching sacks to complete properly, so an ordinary shopping trip for groceries quietly becomes a small strategic mission. Nothing at all goes to waste in this house. The string gets saved and wound into thread. The leftover scraps become patches for the next quilt, and the very last remaining bits of cloth become underwear that nobody in the family will ever discuss out loud. You look perfectly presentable walking into church on Sunday morning, and only you and your mother know that your very best dress once held 20 pounds of self-rising flour on a shelf somewhere. It started out as pure, plain necessity. Flour, sugar, chicken feed, and grain all arrived packed inside sturdy cotton sacks, and frugal women across the country looked at all that perfectly good fabric and simply refused to throw it away once it was empty. At first, the sacks were entirely plain, printed only with the manufacturer's brand name and logo, so the real challenge for a housewife became carefully scrubbing out that printed ink to leave a clean, usable white cloth behind. Some manufacturers, to their credit, even started using a special ink that washed out easily on purpose, a small, quiet kindness aimed squarely at the women who were turning their packaging into pillowcases, dish towels, and nightshirts for their children. Then the companies themselves got genuinely clever about the whole thing. They realized that if families were going to sew clothes out of these sacks regardless, they might as well compete for that loyal business by making the sacks themselves prettier to look at. So they began printing the plain cotton in cheerful florals, neat stripes, playful polka dots, and all sorts of other charming patterns, transforming a simple bag of chicken feed into something close to a genuine fashion statement sitting right there on the general store shelf. Suddenly, the choice of which brand of flour to buy in any given week came down almost entirely to which fabric print would make the nicest little dress for a daughter. Your own mother might walk right past the cheaper flour on the shelf specifically to buy the brand with the exact print. She still needed to complete a set. And store owners themselves learned quickly to keep matching sacks stacked together on the shelf, so their regular shoppers could gradually collect a full matching set over several visits. This whole arrangement created a quiet, informal little economy of trading and hunting that ran alongside the regular economy of actual money. Since a single dress might need 3 or 4 matching sacks to complete, and a family could realistically only buy so much flour at any one time, women across the neighborhood took to swapping patterns with each other, trading with friends, neighbors, and relatives, all trying to assemble enough of the same matching print to finally finish a garment they'd been working on for weeks. It was a little like collecting an entire matching set of fine china, one box of cereal at a time, except the prize waiting at the end of it all was simply a dress your daughter could wear proudly to church on Sunday. Church basements and regular sewing circles quietly became informal trading posts, where a spare sack of blue gingham might get exchanged on the spot for the exact yellow floral print somebody desperately still needed. And the sacks certainly didn't stop at dresses either. Nothing about them ever really went to waste in a household like yours. The cotton itself became shirts, aprons, curtains, tablecloths, and diapers for the youngest children. The heavy thread that had originally stitched the sack closed got carefully unraveled and saved for later sewing projects. The plainer, less decorative sacks became simple towels and wash rags around the kitchen. And even the very humblest leftover scraps eventually found their way into a family quilt, stitched together patch by patch into a warm patchwork blanket that quietly told the story of an entire family's meals, one small square of fabric at a time. A single flour sack, tracked from beginning to end, might live out a dozen different lives before it was finally, truly worn out. And even then, that last threadbare remnant would likely become nothing more than a simple rag for cleaning the kitchen floor. There was no real shame attached to any of this. Not really, because by this point in the decade, nearly everyone in town was doing exactly the same thing. A little girl wearing a flour sack dress to school would sit right down next to another little girl wearing an almost identical flour sack dress, and both of them looked perfectly fine sitting there together. The old stigma simply evaporated once poverty had become, quite plainly, the shared common condition of nearly everyone around you. What might once have felt genuinely embarrassing back in more prosperous times became, instead, simply ordinary, even quietly admirable, a clear sign of a resourceful family making the very most of what little they still had left. This same kind of resourcefulness shows up again and again throughout these hard years, and sometimes it takes a far bolder, more defiant form than simply sewing a dress out of old flour sacks. Sometimes an entire community bands together to openly and cheerfully cheat the system, right out in broad daylight, in front of everyone. Let's go together to a very unusual auction happening down the road. The bank has come today to seize your neighbor's family farm and sell it off piece by piece at a public auction. And the entire surrounding community has quietly decided among themselves that this particular sale is not going to go smoothly at all. Dozens of grim-faced farmers show up together that morning, quietly surround the auctioneer standing on his makeshift platform, and make it unmistakably clear, without ever raising their voices, that any outsider foolish enough to bid more than a few pennies is going to have a genuinely unpleasant afternoon ahead of him. So the family's prized team of workhorses ends up selling for a single nickel. The plow goes for 2 cents. The entire farm, land and all, gets bought back in full for pocket change by the very neighbors standing there, who then quietly hand every last bit of it straight back to the family who owned it in the first place. It is, technically speaking, entirely legal mostly, and it stands as one of the rare, genuine moments where the ordinary little people quietly, decisively win against the powerful. Here is exactly how a farm ends up on the auction block in the first place. When crop prices collapsed across the country, farmers simply could not earn enough from their harvest to pay back the loans they had originally taken out against their land and their equipment. The bank, naturally wanting its money back one way or another, would move to foreclose, seizing the farm outright and selling off everything at a public auction to recover whatever it was still owed. For the family standing there watching, it meant losing not just their house, but their entire way of life all at once. The land their own parents had worked with their hands, the animals they had personally raised from birth, the tools they had depended on every single season. All of it sold off piece by piece to the highest bidder, while the family stood by, forced to watch. This exact scene was playing out across the countryside that year, farm after farm after farm, a genuine epidemic of loss spreading from county to county. The farmers in this particular county decided, quietly and collectively, that they had endured quite enough of watching it happen. They couldn't realistically stop the auctions themselves from being called in the first place, not through any legal means available to them. But they absolutely could control what actually happened once the bidding started, and they set about doing exactly that with a grim, entirely unified resolve. Word would spread quickly through the county that a neighbor's farm was going up for sale, and on the appointed morning, the entire surrounding community would turn out together, not to bid honestly at all, but specifically to make absolutely certain the auction itself became a complete farce from start to finish. They gathered around the auctioneer in a silent, entirely unsmiling crowd, and everyone present understood the unspoken arrangement without a single word needing to be said out loud. This particular sale was going to go a certain way, and any outside stranger who happened to think otherwise had better reconsider his position rather quickly. When the bidding finally opened on some genuinely valuable item, someone in the crowd would call out a single penny as their bid. A team of workhorses worth several $100s under any normal circumstances might draw a bid of 5 cents from the crowd, followed immediately by complete dead silence. If some outside stranger dared to raise the bid himself, hopping quietly to snap up a genuine bargain, he would quickly find himself surrounded by an entire wall of hard, unblinking stares and quiet, pointed suggestions that he keep his money safely in his own pocket. The message being sent was entirely unmistakable, and it rarely, if ever, needed to be repeated a second time. So the horses sold for a nickel. The plow went for 2 cents. The wagon sold for a dime. And item after item went for genuinely laughable sums, purchased entirely by the very same neighbors who had turned out that morning specifically to protect the family losing everything. Once the entire farm had finally been sold off for a grand total of perhaps a few dollars altogether, the neighbors would quietly gather up everything they had just purchased and simply hand it all straight back to the original family who had owned it the day before. The bank walked away with its handful of pennies, technically satisfied. The auction itself had been legally completed from start to finish, exactly as the law required, and the family kept their land, their animals, and their tools, exactly as they had the day before any of it began. It was a legal loophole turned quietly into a genuine weapon, a way of following the strict letter of the law while completely and deliberately defeating its entire underlying purpose. There is something deeply satisfying in hearing about it even now, a rare instance of ordinary people quietly outmaneuvering the powerful forces that had been grinding them down for years. These penny auctions, as people came to call them, never solved the larger crisis playing out across the whole country, and they carried real, genuine risk with them too, since intimidating potential bidders and openly defying the banks could easily bring serious trouble down on the organizers. But they stood, all the same, as a powerful statement of community solidarity, clear proof that a community refusing to abandon its own could bend even a cold, impersonal foreclosure into something that at least resembled justice. Not every family, sadly, was lucky enough to have neighbors quite like that standing behind them, though. For a great many other families, the loss came anyway, quietly and completely, and they found themselves, along with every single thing they owned, deposited right out onto the sidewalk. Let's talk now about coming home to find an eviction already underway. You come home one evening to find your entire life sitting out on the sidewalk. The bed frame, the kitchen chairs, your grandmother's old mantel clock, all of it stacked up together in a sad little pile because you simply could not make the rent this month. Eviction has become common enough by now that nobody really stares for very long, since half the block has already been through the exact same thing themselves, or fully expects to be soon enough. But here is the genuinely strange part of it all. Sometimes, once the landlord's hired men have finally left the scene, the neighbors simply gather round and carry everything straight back inside the apartment, quietly daring anyone at all to come back and try it again. It's a small, stubborn act of rebellion, a genuine piece of decency surviving in a decade that seems almost deliberately designed to crush it out of people. Tonight, you honestly don't know which way this particular evening is going to go, so you sit yourself down on your own overturned dresser, out there on the sidewalk, and you wait quietly to find out. The eviction itself unfolds as a brisk, entirely impersonal affair. The landlord, who has his own share of troubles and his own mortgage payments hanging over his head, sends a couple of men round to empty the apartment while you're either out at work or simply standing there watching helplessly. They carry your furniture down the narrow stairs and set it out on the curb piece by piece until the whole modest inventory of your entire life sits arranged there on the pavement for absolutely anyone walking past to see. There's your mattress lying exposed under the open sky. There's the kitchen table where you ate your Hoover stew together as a family, night after night. There's the framed photograph from your wedding day, the chipped dishes, the children's few remaining toys. Everything you own, suddenly public and more than a little pathetic. Sitting there in the plain light of day, what's genuinely remarkable is just how ordinary this particular scene has become across the whole city by now. In the hardest-hit neighborhoods, evicted furniture sitting out on the sidewalk has become nearly as common a sight as an ordinary lamp post. People simply walk right past without gawking, partly out of basic tact, and partly because they've already seen the exact same scene play out 100 times before and know full well that they themselves might be next. There's a genuine, grim solidarity buried in that shared lack of surprise. Nobody thinks any less of you for it happening, because being poor has stopped being any kind of personal failing now that the whole country has fallen down together at once. Your neighbor lost his own place just last month. The family living upstairs is already behind on their rent too. Eviction has quietly stopped being any kind of scandal at all, and has instead become simply a season that everyone eventually passes through in turn. And that shared, unspoken understanding is exactly what makes the next part of the evening possible at all. On some particularly tight-knit blocks, especially where the neighbors genuinely know and trust one another, the eviction simply doesn't stick. The moment the landlord's men have finally packed up and left, a small crowd quietly gathers on the sidewalk, and without much discussion at all, they pick your bed frame, your chairs, and your grandmother's old clock straight back up, and carry the entire lot right back up the stairs and into your apartment where it belongs. Then they settle in for a while, sometimes literally standing guard by the door, making it perfectly clear to anyone passing by that whoever tries to put your things back out on the street again is going to have a great deal of company to deal with. These impromptu moving crews turn the whole ordeal of eviction into a kind of stubborn, repeating game. The furniture comes out. The neighbors carry it straight back in. It comes out again a few days later. Back in it goes once more. In some cities, organized groups actually made this into a deliberate practice tactic, showing up in real numbers to reverse evictions almost as fast as they happened, gradually wearing the landlords down through sheer patient persistence alone. It's a little like trying to bail water out of a boat, while a dozen other people keep quietly pouring the water right back in behind you. Eventually, the sheer effort involved in evicting any one particular family starts to become more trouble than it's genuinely worth to the landlord, and you get to stay another week, another month, however long the standoff between you happens to hold. Of course, not every single block on every street has that kind of collective muscle behind it, and not every landlord backs down in the face of it either, so plenty of families do still end up genuinely, permanently out on the street in the end. But when the whole scheme does work, it really is a beautiful thing to witness. A quiet reminder that even in the leanest of times, ordinary people still find ways to look out for one another. Tonight, sitting there on your own overturned dresser, you hear footsteps coming down the stairs behind you and voices out in the hallway, and you dare, just barely, to let yourself hope. Community is really what carries most people through these particular years, in the end. And sometimes that same sense of community shows up in far stranger forms than a simple moving crew helping haul furniture back up a flight of stairs. Sometimes it shows up instead as a marathon dance contest, running for days on end, with real cash money riding on the outcome. Let's go put on our dancing shoes together. Under the bright lights of the local dance hall, you are still dancing, and you have now been dancing for 9 straight days without stopping for more than a few minutes at a time. This is a dance marathon, a genuine spectacle in which desperate couples shuffle round and round in slow circles for days and sometimes even weeks on end, purely because the very last pair still standing at the end wins a cash prize. And almost as importantly to most of the couples entered, the promoters running the whole show feed every contestant for as long as the contest continues. Your feet, by this point, are genuinely ruined. Your dance partner is fast asleep on your shoulder while somehow still technically moving her feet in time with yours. And the crowd sitting in the stands has paid good money at the door specifically to watch you both slowly fall apart in front of them. Every hour, a bell rings and you're given a brief rest. Then the bell rings again, and you stagger back upright once more. It's marketed to the public as pure entertainment. It feels, from where you're standing, a great deal more like a slow-motion endurance test being conducted in front of a live, paying audience openly betting on who's going to collapse first. The rules governing the whole contest are brutally simple. You and your partner must keep moving continuously, staying off the floor entirely, for as long as it is humanly possible to manage. Any couple who lets so much as a single knee touch the ground, or who simply stops moving altogether, even for a moment, gets eliminated on the spot. The reward waiting for whichever couple manages to outlast every other pair in the hall is a cash prize, sometimes running to a few $100s, which, in these particular years, represents a small, genuine fortune, well worth suffering enormously to obtain. But the real underlying reason so many couples enter these contests in the first place is simpler, and honestly a good deal sadder than the prize money alone. As long as you remain in the contest, the promoters running the show feed you several full meals a day, served right there on the dance floor between rounds. For the truly desperate couples entering, a marathon like this genuinely means being warm, sheltered, and properly fed for as long as your body can possibly hold out. The daily schedule itself amounts to a kind of slow, drawn-out torture, carefully dressed up as harmless public fun. You dance for roughly 50 minutes out of every single hour, then get a precious 10-minute rest break, during which you might collapse briefly onto a cot, gulp down some hastily served food, or have a tired medic quickly examine your badly swollen feet. Then the bell rings once more, and no matter how genuinely destroyed you feel inside, you have to haul yourself back upright and start moving again immediately. Day and night gradually blur together into one continuous exhausted haze. You learn, out of sheer necessity, how to sleep while technically still standing up, leaning heavily against your partner while your feet keep up a slow, automatic shuffle. One of you dozing off entirely while the other quietly steers the both of you around the floor together. Like two people managing one very tired little boat. The crowd sitting comfortably in the stands, meanwhile, is having a genuinely grand time watching it all unfold. People pay a modest admission fee specifically to sit and watch the contestants down on the floor slowly, visibly deteriorate over the course of days. And part of the whole appeal, uncomfortably enough, is precisely that ongoing deterioration itself. They come specifically to see who's finally going to crack under the strain, who's going to faint clean away, who's going to get into a delirious, half-conscious argument with their own partner at 3 o'clock in the morning in front of everyone. It's a little like an early, brutal ancestor of modern reality television, except in this version the stakes are your own literal physical survival, and the eventual exit interview, for the losing couples, is very often conducted from a stretcher. Promoters running these events actively play up the drama for the crowd, sometimes even staging entirely fake romances or manufactured arguments between certain couples specifically to keep the paying audience hooked and coming back again the following night. There is a real, genuine darkness lurking underneath all those glittering lights strung up over the dance floor. These contests routinely push human bodies far, far past any healthy limit, and contestants regularly suffer hallucinations from sheer exhaustion, serious physical injuries, and sometimes total, complete collapse right there on the floor in front of everyone. Some of these marathons stretch on for weeks at a time, occasionally even for months, the surviving couples gradually reduced to shambling wrecks, propped upright by nothing more than sheer stubborn willpower, and the increasingly distant promise of that prize money waiting at the very end. Critics of the whole business condemn it loudly as genuinely cruel, a grotesque exploitation of desperate, hungry people purely for the entertainment of a paying crowd. And quite honestly, those critics are not wrong about any of it. And yet the contestants keep right on signing up anyway, week after week, because when you're hungry enough, dancing yourself slowly into the ground for a real chance at a few $100s and 3 guaranteed meals a day starts to look, against all reason, like a perfectly reasonable deal. So you shuffle on, hour after hour, your partner drooling gently onto your shoulder, the crowd murmuring somewhere out beyond the glare of the overhead lights. You've made it 9 full days now. Maybe, just maybe, you'll make it to 10. The prize money is still out there somewhere, sitting just past the point of total collapse, and you're stubborn enough even now to keep chasing after it. When the ordeal down at the dance hall finally ends, one way or another, you're going to need to forget it as completely and quickly as you possibly can. And forgetting, as it happens, is exactly the kind of service this particular era knows how to sell cheaply. For a single thin dime, there's a dark, warm room waiting downtown where every one of your troubles seems to disappear for a couple of hours at a stretch. Let's go together to the movies tonight. For one glorious dime, you can leave the entire grinding weight of 1930s America behind you completely, at least for a little while. The movie theater is warm and dark, and packed shoulder to shoulder with other people who need to forget their week just as badly as you do. And for a few precious hours, the screen up front fills with dancing millionaires, singing sweethearts, and staircases built out of pure, glittering imagination. The theater owners know perfectly well that you're broke, so they've taken to luring you in with small gifts on top of the film itself. Some nights they hand out a single free dinner plate as you walk in, one piece at a time, so that families keep coming back week after week specifically to finish assembling the whole set. Other nights there's a cash drawing held right there in the aisle before the picture starts. You watch a full double feature, a newsreel and a short cartoon, and then you step back out into the cold reality you'd briefly managed to pause for a couple of hours. It really is the cheapest, brightest escape that money can almost buy. The value on offer really is unbeatable when you stop to think about it properly. A single dime buys you several full hours of warmth and genuine wonder, and that matters enormously when your own home is cold and your own daily life feels grim in every direction you look. You settle into your seat, the house lights dim slowly, and the troubles waiting for you outside on the sidewalk simply cease to exist for a little while. Up on the screen, elegant men and women in beautiful evening clothes glide gracefully through enormous mansions, fall gently in love, crack quick jokes, and dance across sets so lavish and impossible they seem to belong to an entirely different planet altogether. It is the exact, precise opposite of everything waiting for you in your own daily existence. And that, of course, is entirely the point of the whole exercise. You didn't come here tonight to watch poverty on the screen. You came here specifically to forget it existed at all, if only for an hour or two. The films being made during these particular years understand their own audience perfectly well. Some of them offer pure, glittering fantasy, all top hats and champagne glasses and elaborately choreographed spectacle, letting you pretend, for 2 solid hours, that such a glamorous world might genuinely be real, and maybe even within your own reach someday. Others give you plucky, likable underdogs who triumph against truly impossible odds, sending you back home afterward with a little borrowed hope tucked into your coat pocket. There are gangster pictures where the tough guy on screen simply takes what he wants from a world that's wronged him. There are comedies that let you laugh out loud until your sides genuinely ache. There are musicals so bright and bouncy, they practically seem to glow from inside the screen itself. Whatever particular mood you happen to be carrying into the theater that night, there's a cure waiting for you somewhere on the schedule, and the whole cure costs exactly 1 thin coin. The theaters themselves compete fiercely with one another for your loyal dime, and they've gotten genuinely inventive about how they go about it. On what's known as dish night, the theater hands each paying patron a single piece of dinnerware as they walk through the door, a plate one particular week, a matching cup the next, specifically so that families feel compelled to keep coming back again and again in order to assemble a complete set over time. It's a genuinely brilliant little scheme that quietly turns an ordinary night at the movies into a long-term household project. And many a Depression-era china cabinet across the country ended up filled entirely through nothing but loyal, weekly movie attendance. Other theaters instead hold cash drawings before the film begins, printing up numbered tickets and awarding a small cash prize to whichever lucky patron holds the winning number, dangling the tempting dream of easy money in front of a crowd that badly, genuinely needs it. Between the film itself, the free dish handed out at the door, and the small chance at a cash jackpot, that single dime starts to feel like a genuinely remarkable bargain. The full evening's program stretches the value of that dime even further still. For your money, you get not just a single feature film, but very often two full films shown back to back, a proper double bill that keeps you comfortably seated in your chair for the entire evening. Between the two films, there's a newsreel bringing you moving pictures from the wider world beyond your own town, and a short cartoon specifically to make the children in the audience laugh out loud, and perhaps a short comedy sketch or a serial adventure that ends deliberately on a cliffhanger, ensuring you'll be back again next week to find out what happens. It amounts to an entire evening of proper entertainment, all packed into a single 10-cent admission, and people squeeze every possible second of value out of it, genuinely reluctant to step back out into the dark and cold once the final reel finishes. But the film always ends eventually, no matter how good it was. The house lights always come back up, and you always eventually have to leave. You file out with the rest of the crowd, blinking hard in the sudden light, the fantasy already beginning to fade around the edges, and the familiar, heavy weight of real life settles right back down onto your shoulders the moment the cold night air hits your face outside. Still, for a couple of hours that evening, you were genuinely somewhere else entirely. Someone else entirely. And that brief reprieve, however temporary, was honestly worth every single penny it cost you. Not everyone chases their escape at the movie theater, though. Some people go looking for something closer to an actual miracle instead, a genuine way to somehow turn a little bit of money into a great deal more, and the humble mailbox becomes, quite unexpectedly, the unlikely stage for a nationwide fever dream that sweeps across the whole country. Let's open one of these very tempting letters together and see what it says. A letter arrives one afternoon carrying a truly exciting promise. Simply mail a single dime to the name printed at the very top of an enclosed list, then add your own name to the bottom of that same list, and send fresh copies of the whole letter along to several of your closest friends. Do exactly this. The letter promises, and very soon dimes will supposedly come raining down on you by the thousands from strangers all across the country. This particular craze becomes known as the send-a-dime scheme, and it sweeps across the entire country like a genuine fever, clogging up local post offices completely and turning ordinary, sensible people into part-time amateur mathematicians, all quietly dreaming of impossible fortunes arriving any day now in the mail. It is, of course, nothing more than a pyramid scheme held together entirely by wishful thinking, and almost everyone who participates loses their dime in the end. But when you're this genuinely poor, even a foolish little hope starts to feel very much like an actual plan worth trying. So you lick the stamp, mail off your dime, and start quietly counting money that, in all likelihood, you are never actually going to see. The pitch itself is dangerously appealing when you first read it through. The letter contains a printed list of names and addresses. You mail a dime to whoever's name sits at the very top of that list, cross their name off, add your own name down at the bottom, and mail fresh copies out to several of your own friends. Each of those friends, in turn, does exactly the same thing, sending a dime up the chain themselves and recruiting still more people to join in below them. In theory, as your own name slowly climbs its way up toward the top of thousands of these letters now circulating simultaneously around the country, dimes are supposed to come flooding into your own mailbox from complete strangers scattered all across America. A single dime and a couple of postage stamps, the letter promises with total confidence, will eventually multiply themselves into a genuine small fortune. All you have to do, it insists, is simply not break the chain yourself. For a whole nation full of broke and thoroughly desperate people, the appeal of this particular scheme is entirely obvious. A dime is almost nothing at all to risk losing, and the potential reward, at least on paper, sounds genuinely life-changing. So the letters spread like an actual wildfire that summer. People copy them out carefully by hand, or line up patiently to have them properly typed, then mail them off to absolutely everyone they know personally. Whole towns seem to catch the same fever within the space of a single week. The sheer volume of mail involved becomes so enormous that local post offices are physically overwhelmed by it, buried under entire sacks of letters carrying hopeful dimes, staff working long overtime hours just to keep the flood of mail moving at all. For one brief, slightly mad moment that summer, it genuinely seems as though the entire country has decided to play the exact same game all at once. The trouble, as always happens with schemes exactly like this one, comes down to simple arithmetic. The chain only actually pays off if it keeps growing forever, without ever stopping, and each new layer down the chain requires several times more participants than the layer that came directly before it. But there are only so many people living in the entire country, and the required numbers explode past the total population almost immediately once you actually work through the math. Very quickly indeed, there is simply nobody new left anywhere to recruit into the chain. It collapses entirely, and the overwhelming majority of everyone who participated gets absolutely nothing back at all for their dime and their postage stamp. Only the tiny handful of people who happen to be sitting near the very top of the very earliest letters ever see any real return on their small investment. Everyone else has, in effect, simply mailed their money straight into a void. Deep down, quite a lot of people sense this uncomfortable truth even as they're mailing off their own dime. The underlying math really isn't very hard to work out for yourself if you sit down and actually try, and plenty of folks recognize the whole scheme, quite clearly, as a fool's errand, even while they're actively taking part in it themselves. But knowing something is genuinely foolish, and actually having the willpower to resist doing it anyway, turn out to be two entirely different matters, especially when you're already poor and the price of admission is only a single dime. There's a peculiar, genuine comfort in doing something, anything at all, that carries even the faintest scent of real possibility about it. Mailing that dime off feels a little like taking real action, like buying a lottery ticket, like refusing, in some small private way, to simply sit still and quietly accept your own lot in life. Hope, even a genuinely irrational hope, turns out to be its own peculiar kind of nourishment when there's precious little else available. So the craze burns bright for a few short weeks, and then, like every fever eventually does, it breaks. The promised dimes stop arriving, or rather, they never really arrived in the first place for most people, and the letters themselves gradually stop circulating as the novelty wears off and the disappointment quietly sets in across the country. People are left out their money and their postage, feeling a little poorer than before, and perhaps a little wiser too, though the next tempting scheme along these same lines is never very far behind the last one. Poverty, it turns out, makes people genuinely vulnerable to false cures of every conceivable kind, and that particular vulnerability is nowhere more dangerous than when it comes to matters concerning your own family's health. Let's peek together inside the family medicine cabinet now, where the cure on offer might very well turn out to be considerably worse than the original disease. You're feeling genuinely unwell tonight, so you reach for the family medicine cabinet, which amounts to a real gamble in an era like this one. All manner of tonics and so-called cure-alls are sold quite openly with bold promises attached, and almost no real government oversight whatsoever standing behind any of it. A great many of these bottled remedies contain ingredients that would genuinely horrify a modern doctor if they knew the full list. There are syrups laced heavily with alcohol. There are soothing remedies built around ingredients best left entirely unnamed. There are so-called miracle waters that do a great deal more harm than any actual good. You simply cannot afford a real, properly trained physician, so instead you trust the printed label, take a hopeful swig straight from the bottle, and wait to see whether you feel better afterward, or at the very least, feel different. Sometimes the cure genuinely works as promised. Sometimes the cure turns out to be the actual problem itself. Either way, you have precious few other real options available to you, so down it goes, and you cross your fingers and hope for the best. The whole world of patent medicine during these years is a genuinely wild and completely unregulated place. Traveling salesmen and mail-order catalogs peddle bottle after bottle, promising confidently to cure everything from a simple headache to baldness to serious, life-threatening disease. And the promises printed on the label only grow bolder the more genuinely desperate the customer happens to be. The labels themselves make grand, sweeping claims backed up by absolutely nothing at all, decorated with reassuring language and impressive-sounding ingredient names. There is very little in the way of actual testing behind any of it, very little honest labeling telling you what's genuinely inside the bottle, and very little real recourse available to you if the stuff turns out to be entirely useless, or worse, genuinely dangerous to your health. You are, in effect, trusting a complete stranger's advertisement with your own body, and that stranger is primarily trying to make a sale, not particularly trying to keep you healthy in the process. Inside those attractively labeled bottles, you might genuinely find almost anything at all. Many popular tonics are quite heavy with alcohol, which is precisely why they make you feel warm and cheerful shortly after taking them, and precisely why so many otherwise perfectly sober citizens develop a surprisingly deep, nightly loyalty to their evening dose of medicine. Other tonics contain harsh chemical compounds, or genuinely powerful substances, or ingredients whose long-term effects on the human body are poorly understood at best, and genuinely harmful at worst. A soothing syrup marketed specifically to quiet a fussy, crying baby might well contain something that quiets that baby a great deal more thoroughly than any responsible parent would ever actually want. The line separating a genuine remedy from an outright poison is often disturbingly blurry, and the printed label offers you almost no real help at all in figuring out which particular side of that line you happen to be standing on. The reason people take this particular risk anyway is really the same reason they take so many other genuine risks throughout these hard years. A real, properly trained doctor costs real money, and money happens to be the one thing that absolutely nobody seems to have anymore. A proper house call, or a visit to an actual clinic, has become a genuine luxury reserved strictly for emergencies, and often, sadly, not even then. So ordinary aches, ordinary fevers, and ordinary everyday illnesses all get treated quietly at home instead, with whatever happens to already be sitting on the shelf. That bottle of dubious tonic is, after all, a great deal cheaper than an actual physician's visit would be. So you reach for it first, quite naturally, and simply hope it does the job required of it. It's a little like fixing some delicate piece of machinery by simply giving it one good, hard shake, purely because you genuinely cannot afford the trained mechanic, and shaking it yourself is, at least, completely free. Sometimes, of course, the home remedy genuinely does help, or at the very least does no real additional harm while your own body quietly heals itself in the background regardless. A soothing syrup might ease a nagging cough just enough to finally let you get some real sleep, and sleep might well have been exactly what your body actually needed all along. But sometimes, unfortunately, the so-called cure makes matters genuinely worse, deepening the original illness, causing entirely new problems of its own, or quietly fostering a lasting dependence on whatever potent ingredient happens to be hiding inside that particular bottle. And because absolutely nobody is truly minding the store on any of this, you very often have no real way of knowing in advance which particular outcome you're actually buying, until it is already far too late to change course. You swallow the mystery down and take your chances, the exact same way you take your chances with almost everything else these days. Slowly, over the course of these years and the ones that follow directly afterward, the sheer, obvious danger of this entire unregulated free-for-all eventually pushes the country toward genuinely better rules governing what can legally be sold and what must honestly be printed on a label. But that particular reckoning arrives only very gradually, and for right now, tonight, you are entirely on your own with your modest cabinet full of hopeful little poisons. Medicine of nearly every kind remains genuinely scarce and thoroughly unreliable throughout these years, which means that when something truly goes wrong in a household, the actual treatment very often falls to whoever in the family happens to have the steadiest nerves and the strongest stomach for it. Nowhere is that particular truth clearer than when a tooth finally goes bad. Let's gather round the kitchen table together tonight for a bit of home dentistry. A tooth has gone bad on you, and the throbbing pain has kept you awake now for 3 long nights running. A proper dentist would genuinely be lovely to have right about now, but a dentist costs real money that you simply don't have sitting around, so the job falls instead to the kitchen table, and whatever steady hand happens to be available in the house tonight. Out come the pliers from the toolbox. Somebody offers you a good swallow of something strong to help dull the worst of the pain. Somebody else steps behind you to hold your shoulders firmly in place, and the rest of it is genuinely best left undescribed in any real detail. Home medicine during these particular years amounts to a rough mixture of old folk wisdom, sheer raw nerve, and grim, unavoidable necessity. You set broken bones using splints fashioned from old broom handles, and you treat fevers with cold, damp cloths and quiet prayer. It isn't that people genuinely trust these homemade methods, not really. It's that when you have absolutely nothing else available to you, you simply become your own reluctant family doctor by necessity. The bad tooth itself is a very particular kind of misery to live with. The pain builds slowly over days, moving from a faint twinge to a dull ache, to a relentless pounding throb that eventually fills your entire head and steals away every bit of sleep and sense you have left. There's no ignoring it once it reaches that stage, no simply waiting it out patiently, and no gentle remedy sitting on a drugstore shelf strong enough to actually touch it. In better times, only a year or 2 earlier, you would have simply gone to see the dentist downtown and been done with the whole business in an afternoon. But these are not better times anymore, and a professional extraction now costs considerably more than your family can possibly spare. So the bad tooth stays right where it is, and the pain keeps building, until finally the whole household agrees together that something genuinely has to be done about it, and that something is going to have to be done right there at home. The kitchen becomes, for one evening, the family's makeshift operating theater. The table gets cleared off completely. The pliers get located in the toolbox and given a quick wipe with a clean rag, and a bottle of whiskey, or whatever strong drink happens to be available in the house that particular week, gets brought out to serve as the only real painkiller on hand. You take a good, long pull straight from the bottle to steady your nerves and numb the very worst of what's coming, which honestly helps a good deal less than you genuinely hoped it would. A family member positions themselves carefully behind you, gripping your shoulders or the back of your head firmly, because your own body's natural instinct is going to be to pull sharply away from the very thing that absolutely has to happen next. Then the pliers finally find the tooth. Someone in the room takes a deep breath, and the extraction itself begins. It's over quickly if you happen to be lucky that night, and it is never, under any circumstances, remotely pleasant to sit through. This same do-it-yourself approach to medicine extends a great deal further than just bad teeth, too. When a bone breaks somewhere in the family, and there simply isn't money available for a proper doctor's visit, families splint the injury themselves at home, binding the affected limb straight and steady with whatever happens to be rigid and close at hand: a length of scrap wood, a stout broom handle, a sturdy stick pulled from the yard, hopping quietly that it all sets properly in the end. Fevers get fought off with cold compresses and enforced bed rest. Open wounds get carefully cleaned out and bound up tightly with clean strips of cloth, and nearly every ailment that comes up in the household gets met with some homemade remedy, carefully passed down over the years from parents and grandparents before them. Some of this inherited folk medicine is genuinely sensible, hard-won wisdom that actually works reliably. Some of it is essentially useless, and a small, unfortunate portion of it is actively harmful to whoever it's used on. But every bit of it, good or bad, is completely free, and free happens to be exactly what your family can actually afford right now. This particular knowledge lives quietly in the household itself, usually carried and remembered by the women who run it day to day. A mother becomes, almost by default, the family's doctor, nurse, and pharmacist, all rolled into one single role, expected to know exactly what to do the moment a child burns a small hand on the stove, or spikes a sudden high fever overnight, or comes home from playing outside with a nasty gash that needs proper tending. She keeps her whole collection of remedies stored carefully in her own memory, and her modest supplies tucked away in the kitchen cupboard, and she simply does the very best she possibly can with nothing more than cloth, clean water, a few dried herbs, and sheer raw nerve. It amounts to an enormous, quiet responsibility, carried without complaint on shoulders that are already loaded down with plenty else besides, and she very rarely receives any real thanks for it beyond the simple, quiet relief of watching a sick child finally fall into a deep, peaceful sleep through the night. So the bad tooth finally comes out there on the kitchen table, and the very worst of the pain goes right along with it, and everyone in the family quietly pretends afterward that it really wasn't so terribly bad after all. You rinse your mouth carefully with salt water, press a clean cloth firmly against the gap left behind, and count yourself genuinely lucky that the whole ordeal is finally over and done with. This is simply how health and medicine work now in your household, handled entirely at home with sheer grit and constant improvisation, because the real alternative simply doesn't exist for a family in your particular position. And that same brutal, unforgiving arithmetic that puts a pair of pliers directly into your trembling hand also forces a great many families into far harder choices still. Choices about exactly who eats, and who ultimately has to leave the table altogether. Sometimes there is simply one mouth too many sitting around the family table, and one of those mouths happens to belong to someone very young indeed. Let's talk now about the children who quietly set out entirely on their own. There is one more mouth at your family's table than the household can realistically feed, and everyone sitting around that table already knows it perfectly well, even though nobody has actually said it out loud yet. So across the entire country this particular year, teenagers, some of them barely old enough yet to properly shave, quietly pack a small bag of belongings and simply walk out the door, hoping sincerely that one less person eating at home will help their younger brothers and sisters actually survive the coming winter. They join the great, drifting crowds of travelers out on the freight trains, sleeping rough in rail yards at night, and lining up patiently at strangers' back doors, hopping for a small chance to do some work in direct exchange for a single warm meal. Some of these young travelers are genuinely searching for real work somewhere down the line. Others, if you ask them honestly, are simply searching, full stop, without any clear destination in mind at all. It is nothing remotely like the grand adventure the movies would later suggest to audiences looking back on these years, and the great majority of these young travelers are genuinely frightened, and honestly far too young for any part of what they're now living through. Tonight, one particular child among them is riding alone inside a dark boxcar, watching the shadowed fields roll silently past in the darkness outside, quietly wondering where exactly home even is anymore. The actual decision to leave is very rarely spoken aloud within the family, but everyone involved understands it completely all the same. When a family simply cannot feed every single member sitting at the table, the older children among them face a genuinely impossible piece of math to work through. Staying at home means quietly taking food directly out of the mouths of younger brothers and sisters who cannot yet properly fend for themselves. Leaving instead means one less plate that needs filling each night, one less body that needs keeping warm through the winter, a genuine, painful gift given to the rest of the family simply by walking quietly out the front door one morning. So they go, very often carrying a parent's tearful blessing with them, and sometimes leaving without saying a single proper word of goodbye at all, carrying nothing but a small bundle of belongings and a heart genuinely full of fear that they refuse to openly admit to anyone, least of all to themselves. It is, in every honest sense, a real sacrifice dressed up outwardly as something closer to an adventure, and both the departing child and the parents left behind know perfectly well which one it truly is underneath. Out on the open road, these young travelers join the exact same rough, unforgiving world that grown men have been riding through for years already. They hop aboard the same freight trains, dodge the same railroad police, and sleep wherever they can manage to find even a scrap of real shelter, in rail yards in hobo jungles, tucked underneath highway bridges. They knock on farmhouse doors along the way and offer to chop firewood, or haul water, or take on any honest chore at all, in direct exchange for a single plate of food. Some manage to find genuine seasonal work out in the fields, picking crops alongside grown adults for little more than a pittance in wages. Many others find absolutely nothing at all, and simply keep moving steadily from one town to the next, always hungry, always quietly hopeful that the very next place down the line will somehow prove kinder than the last one was. The dangers waiting out there are genuinely everywhere, and genuinely enormous, for someone quite this young to be facing entirely alone. There are sudden, brutal accidents happening on the trains themselves, accidents that leave young riders maimed, or sometimes killed outright, with very little warning beforehand. There are openly hostile towns to pass through, and hard-eyed local officials who want absolutely nothing to do with some ragged young stranger passing through their jurisdiction. There are certain dangerous people out along the road who specifically prey on the weak and the completely alone, and a lone teenage traveler makes for a genuinely easy target in that world. There is bitter cold and real sickness, and the deep, gnawing loneliness that comes from being a child with no home nearby, no family within easy reach, and no real certainty at all about where the next proper meal or the next genuinely safe night's sleep might actually come from. It is a hard, frequently frightening existence that ages a young person a great deal faster than it reasonably should. And yet, in the strange, resilient way that human beings so often manage, there is also a rough, real camaraderie to be found out there among these young wanderers. They share what little food they have with one another, trade useful information freely, look out for each other in the hobo jungles at night, and swap stories about the places they've already passed through and the places still worth trying further down the line. Some of them form small traveling groups together, purely for safety and simple company along the road. There are even occasional moments of genuine fun scattered throughout it all, moments of real freedom, of glimpsing a far wider world than the small hometown they originally set out from. But it would be a genuine lie to paint the whole experience as some kind of carefree lark. Underneath every single campfire song being sung, there sits a homesick kid who would gladly trade every bit of it in an instant for one warm kitchen and the simple sound of his own mother's voice calling him in for supper. Many of these traveling children do eventually find their own way back home again, or manage to find steady work somewhere, or simply grow up gradually out there on the open road and become adults well before their proper time. Others, sadly, are never heard from again, quietly swallowed whole by the vast, uncertain country they originally set out into with such quiet hope. It stands as one of the quietest, least discussed tragedies of these entire years, an entire generation of young people scattered far and wide by nothing more than simple hunger. But hunger and genuine hardship don't fall exclusively on the young and the anonymous during these years. Sometimes they fall just as hard on the very men who once proudly wore their own country's uniform into battle. And when those particular men are finally ignored one time too many, they decide together to make themselves genuinely impossible to ignore any longer. Let's march together on Washington now, alongside them. In the summer of 1932, thousands of veterans who had fought together in the Great War traveled to Washington, bringing their wives and their children along with them, and set up a genuine camp in the very shadow of the Capitol building itself. These men fought loyally for their own country not so very long ago, and now they are simply asking their government to pay out early on a bonus payment they were formally promised years earlier for that same service, because right now they are genuinely hungry, and that promised money would very plainly mean actual survival for their families. They build an orderly little settlement together out of scrap lumber and canvas tents, and they wait there, entirely peacefully, for some kind of real answer from their government. What happens next stands as one of the genuinely harder moments in this whole story to sit with quietly, because the camp is eventually cleared out by force and burned to the ground. These are men who were called genuine heroes barely a decade earlier, now standing together and watching their own makeshift shelters go up in smoke in front of their wives and children. It is a scene the country does not soon manage to forget, no matter how hard some tried to move past it. The bonus itself in question is entirely real and genuinely owed to these men. After the Great War concluded, the government had formally promised its returning veterans a payment for their wartime service, a bonus to be properly paid out years later, at some distant point in the future. But that particular future arrived a great deal earlier than anyone had planned for, in the sudden form of the Depression, and the veterans themselves, now jobless and hungry right alongside everyone else in the country, simply could not see any real sense in patiently waiting years longer for money they desperately needed right now, today. If the country genuinely owed them this bonus, they reasoned together, then let the country simply pay it out now, at the exact moment when it might actually mean the real difference between feeding their own families and going under entirely. So they resolved together to travel to the Capitol and ask for it in person, gathering in numbers large enough that they simply could not be easily ignored or dismissed. They came from absolutely everywhere across the country, riding the same freight trains, driving broken-down old trucks that barely still ran, many of them bringing their wives and children along specifically because there was genuinely nobody left back home to leave them with. Once in Washington, they gathered together by the thousands and built an entire camp, a sprawling settlement of shacks and canvas tents thrown together out of scrap lumber, old packing crates, and whatever other material could be scavenged nearby. It looked, in many ways, remarkably similar to the shanty towns springing up across the rest of the country that same year, except this particular one sat right in the very heart of the nation's capital, in plain, open view of the actual seat of federal power itself. The men organized their whole camp with real military discipline, keeping it scrupulously clean and orderly, holding themselves to exactly the same standards they had first learned years earlier while wearing their country's uniform. For several long weeks, they waited together and demonstrated entirely peacefully, formally asking their own government to finally make good on its earlier promise. They were not, by any reasonable measure, a mob. They were veterans, many of them formally decorated for their service, conducting themselves throughout with real dignity and real restraint, singing the old wartime songs together and drilling in formation, almost as if to quietly remind everyone watching exactly who they truly were. They genuinely hoped that the sight of so many former soldiers gathered together in such obvious, plain need might move the lawmakers inside to finally act on their behalf. But the request, when it finally came to a vote, was formally denied. The proposed measures to pay the bonus out early failed to pass, and the men were left camped out in the capital with nothing at all to show for their long journey, beyond the slowly growing, weary patience of genuinely desperate people. Then came the order to finally remove them from the Capitol grounds entirely, and that removal turned ugly almost immediately. Rather than being met with any real sympathy or offered practical aid, the veterans instead found themselves confronted directly by the very same army they had once proudly served in themselves. Sent in specifically to clear the camp out, their makeshift settlement was broken apart by force and then deliberately set alight, the shacks and canvas tents burning to the ground while the men, women, and children who had been living inside them fled through the resulting smoke and confusion. The resulting image of soldiers actively driving out fellow veterans, of a government quite literally burning down the shelters of the very men who had once fought for it, struck the wider public like a genuine physical blow. It seemed, to a great many ordinary Americans watching from a distance, to capture everything that had gone badly wrong with the country that year, this creeping sense that ordinary people had been thoroughly abandoned by the very powers that were supposed to protect them. The whole affair leaves a deep and genuinely lasting mark on the national mood. It shocks and enjars a great many ordinary citizens watching from home, hardening the widespread feeling that something in the country has become badly, fundamentally broken, and that those in positions of real power have lost meaningful touch with the suffering playing out all around them. The veterans themselves go home in the end with empty hands and a genuinely bitter story to tell. But the memory of exactly what happened that summer does not fade away quietly, and it quietly feeds a growing national hunger for real change in the years that follow. That same hunger runs all through the rest of this decade, and it takes many different forms as it goes, some of them genuinely dignified, and some of them decidedly not. Because when people start to feel truly robbed by the powerful, they sometimes begin cheering, quite openly, for the very men who are out there robbing the powerful right back. Let's meet now the outlaws that the public itself quietly turned into folk heroes. The newspapers this year are absolutely full of stories about bank robbers, and here is the genuinely uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of it. A great many perfectly ordinary people are quietly rooting for them anyway. When a young outlaw couple traveling together, or a smiling, charismatic gunman leading his own gang, holds up some local bank, plenty of regular folks simply cannot help but feel a small flicker of real satisfaction at the news, because that very same bank may well be the one that foreclosed on their own family farm, or that swallowed their entire life savings whole just a year or two earlier. These particular outlaws become genuine, strange celebrities in their own right, their exploits followed eagerly in the papers like an ongoing serial adventure, their crimes wrapped up quietly in a popular myth about the little man finally striking back against the powerful. It isn't that people genuinely approve of the shooting and the outright stealing involved. Not exactly. It's that they are furious, and they feel entirely powerless, and these reckless, defiant characters feel, however wrongly, like a kind of revenge riding through on horseback on their behalf. To really understand the public sympathy at work here, you first have to understand the genuine anger sitting underneath it. The banks are not, by any means, particularly beloved institutions right now, anywhere in the country. They are the very same institutions that failed catastrophically and took ordinary people's hard-earned savings down with them into ruin. The ones that foreclosed mercilessly on family farms and evicted struggling families from their homes, all while somehow appearing to prosper themselves even as everyone else around them was drowning. So when some bandit walks calmly into a bank and cleans out the till in front of everyone, a certain grim, quiet satisfaction genuinely ripples out across the surrounding countryside. In the public imagination taking hold that year, the robber isn't really stealing from ordinary people at all. He's stealing instead from the very machine that ruined so many of them in the first place. And there's a rough, undeniable poetry buried in that idea, which no amount of proper moralizing can quite manage to erase entirely. The newspapers themselves understand this particular public appetite perfectly well, and they feed it relentlessly, week after week. They chronicle every daring holdup and every narrow escape in breathless, loving detail, turning these various outlaws into ongoing characters within a genuine national drama that unfolds fresh with each new edition. Readers follow their exploits the exact same way they'd follow a movie serial at the theater, eager for the next thrilling installment. Secretly half-hopping, the bandits somehow manage to get away clean. The robbers themselves become genuine household names, their photographs studied closely, their movements tracked eagerly across state lines, their individual personalities dissected in loving detail by readers who have never once met them. A particularly clever getaway, or a genuinely bold escape from a surrounded hideout, only serves to burnish the growing legend further still. In a decade genuinely starved for excitement, and hungry for absolutely anyone who seems to defy the odds successfully, these particular criminals offer up a dark, thrilling kind of popular entertainment that fits the mood of the moment perfectly. Some of these outlaws even play the role quite deliberately themselves, carefully cultivating a public image as the charming rogue who robs specifically from the rich and troubles specifically the powerful. Stories spread widely, some of them entirely true, and some of them almost certainly invented after the fact, of bandits who supposedly tore up mortgage papers during a robbery, or who quietly slipped a little cash to struggling folks they happened to pass along the way. Whether or not any particular tale genuinely holds up under real scrutiny, these stories stick in the public imagination anyway, because people quite badly want them to be true. They want, quite desperately, to believe that someone out there really is fighting back on their behalf, that the little man isn't entirely helpless after all, that the scales of justice can somehow still be balanced, even by the wrong pair of hands. The outlaw becomes a genuine folk hero in the public mind, not because he is actually a good man in any real sense, but because he is defiant, and defiance happens to be in genuinely short supply that particular year. Of course, the underlying reality is a great deal uglier than the popular legend ever suggests. These are, in truth, violent people leading violent lives. And their actual paths through the world are littered with real victims, including innocent bystanders and honest lawmen, and sometimes even the very ordinary people the popular myth pretends they're supposedly out there protecting. The romantic image conveniently overlooks all the actual bloodshed, the real fear, and the genuine lasting harm left behind in their wake wherever they pass through. A bank robbery, when you strip away the myth, is not some noble act of popular rebellion. It is a genuinely dangerous crime, and the folk hero glow fades a great deal faster for anyone unlucky enough to be standing inside that particular bank when the actual shooting starts. The myth offers real comfort to a struggling public, but it was never really the truth to begin with, and the endings for these outlaws are almost always exactly the same. The law eventually closes in around them, the chase reaches its final, violent climax, and the outlaw who lived by the gun dies by it in turn, cut down in a sudden hail of bullets on some lonely stretch of road, or inside some surrounded building far from home. The public mourns the news and thrills at it in roughly equal measure, and the legend itself quietly outlives the actual person, growing a little taller with each retelling passed along afterward. It's a genuinely strange kind of fame, purchased at a truly terrible price. Not all the losses playing out during these years come at the point of a gun, though. Most of them arrive a great deal more quietly, with nothing more than a polite knock at the front door and a truck idling patiently at the curb outside. Let's meet now, the man who comes calling to take back everything you once bought on credit. Back when times were still genuinely good, not so very long ago, you bought the family car, the radio set, and the fine new living room furniture all on the installment plan, paying a little bit each month toward the total. Then your regular paycheck stopped coming altogether, and now there's a polite, but genuinely firm, knock sounding at your front door. The repossession man has come around to reclaim everything in your house that you haven't yet fully paid off, which, these particular days, amounts to very nearly everything you own. He hauls off the icebox first, then the good sofa, then the automobile parked outside that you couldn't really afford to put fuel in anyway, leaving your family's home just a little emptier with each separate visit he makes. It's become a genuinely humiliating little ritual, repeated up and down your entire street. You learn in time to recognize the particular sound of his truck's engine from 2 blocks away, to dread that very particular knock at the door, and to feel the quiet, familiar sting of watching your own comfortable past get loaded up piece by piece and driven away for good. The whole trouble genuinely began back in the good times, though nobody thought of it in quite those terms while it was actually happening. In the prosperous years leading up to the crash, a wonderful new idea had taken hold across the entire country. You no longer needed to save up patiently for the things you actually wanted. You could simply buy them right away instead, and pay for them gradually afterward, a modest sum each month, enjoying full use of the car and the furniture and the household appliances, while you slowly paid them off bit by bit over time. It genuinely felt like a kind of magic trick, as though the future itself had somehow arrived early, and families across the country filled their homes eagerly with fine new possessions they hadn't technically finished purchasing yet. The catch buried inside the whole arrangement, entirely invisible back in those sunny days, was that none of it actually, legally belonged to you until that very last monthly payment was finally made in full. When the Depression finally hit, and your regular income simply vanished overnight, those monthly payments suddenly became completely impossible to keep up with, and that invisible catch turned almost instantly into a very visible, very real crisis sitting right there in your living room. You obviously cannot keep paying for the good sofa if you can't even manage to pay for supper that same week. So the payments naturally stop coming. And once they stop, the company that originally sold you all those goods has every legal right in the world to come around and simply take them back again. Enter the repossession man, whose genuinely unhappy job it is to knock politely on doors and reclaim merchandise from families who have quietly fallen behind on payment. He is not, in most cases, a genuinely cruel person by nature. But he is, without question, the human face of loss for your family, and his arrival at your door means another piece of your life is about to get carried out to his waiting truck. Watching it all happen is a genuinely peculiar kind of agony to sit through. These aren't luxuries you were ever flaunting to your neighbors, but simply the ordinary furnishings of what used to be a decent, comfortable life. The icebox that kept your family's food properly cool through the summer, the comfortable chair sitting by the front window, the radio set that used to gather the whole family together each evening after supper. The automobile parked out front, once a genuine symbol of everything you had worked so hard to climb toward. One by one, all of it goes right back down the front path and onto the waiting truck. And with each separate item that leaves, the house grows a little barer, and the sharp, familiar sense of decline grows a little sharper still. It's a little like watching your own recent prosperity get quietly repossessed right alongside the actual furniture, wheeled away in broad daylight for every single neighbor on the street to plainly see. There's a particular kind of humiliation built into just how public the whole process is. Everyone else on your block already knows exactly what that particular truck means, because everyone on the block has either already had their own visit from it, or fully expects one coming soon enough. You're not really being singled out personally, which helps a little, at least in a small way, but the plain sight of your own belongings loaded onto that curb still announces your family's troubles to the entire street at once. You learn, over time, the particular sound of that engine, the exact shape of that particular truck, and your stomach genuinely drops every single time it turns the corner onto your road. Some families, understandably, take to hiding their most precious remaining items ahead of time, or arrange quietly to have them kept elsewhere entirely, Small private acts of resistance against the slow, steady reclaiming of everything they'd built together. So the house empties out slowly, item by item, and you adjust to each loss in turn because there is genuinely nothing else left to do about it. You learn bit by bit to live with less, and then somehow with even less still, gradually discovering just how many possessions a family can actually manage to do entirely without. The car goes, and you learn to walk everywhere instead. The radio goes, and your evenings at home grow noticeably quieter than they used to be. It amounts to a slow, relentless stripping away of the small comforts you once took completely for granted back before any of this began. But when money runs quite this short for quite this long, people inevitably get creative about finding some way to hold on regardless. And sometimes, the genuine answer to a looming loss turns out to be throwing your own front door wide open and turning raw desperation itself into something resembling a proper party. Let's roll back the living room rug together and dance the coming month's rent into existence. Rent is due tomorrow morning. You are genuinely short on the money, and eviction is now looming directly over your family's head. So tonight, you decide to throw a party specifically to save your own home. This is what people call a rent party, a beloved survival tactic, especially alive and thriving in the crowded apartment buildings of Harlem, where you charge a small admission fee right at the door, fry up whatever food you can manage to afford, roll back the living room rug, and let a hired piano player fill the whole room with music clear through until the early hours of the morning. Neighbors pour in from up and down the building, coins clink steadily into a jar sitting by the door, and by the time morning finally arrives, you have, with any luck at all, gathered together just enough money to keep a roof over your family's head for one more month. It's genuine hardship dressed up cleverly as a celebration, a way of turning raw desperation into something that at least resembles a good time. And honestly, after the particular week everyone in the building has just been through, the dancing itself isn't really only about the rent money anymore. The underlying logic of the whole thing is beautifully, elegantly simple when you think it through properly. You cannot possibly make the rent entirely on your own this month, but if enough different people each contribute just a small amount toward the total, the combined sum might just barely cover it in the end. So you turn your own cramped apartment into a proper venue for one single night, spread the word quietly around the neighborhood, and invite everyone in for an evening of live music, hot food, and dancing, all in direct exchange for a modest fee collected right at the door. Everyone attending understands the real arrangement perfectly well going in. The guests showing up aren't merely paying for a fun night out. They are, in a very real sense, chipping in together to help keep a neighbor properly housed, knowing full well that next month, they themselves might very easily be the ones standing there passing around the jar instead. It amounts to genuine mutual aid, cleverly disguised as a good time, and it works precisely because the entire surrounding community happens to be riding in exactly the same leaky boat together. The preparations themselves manage to turn a cramped, ordinary apartment into something briefly festive and alive. You push all the furniture back hard against the walls, roll up the living room rug completely to clear a proper floor for dancing, and set out whatever food you can manage to cook up and sell that particular night: fried fish, pig's feet, chitlins, and other cheap, filling southern fare that stretches a long way on a tight budget. Word of the party spreads by handwritten bills tacked up around the block, and by simple word of mouth passed neighbor to neighbor, sometimes on little printed cards carrying a clever rhyme announcing the exact time and place. Then, come evening, the guests start arriving steadily, pay their small fee at the door, and pack themselves comfortably into the available rooms, and the apartment that had felt so genuinely heavy with worry just an hour earlier suddenly fills right up with warmth and noise, and the rich smell of good cooking drifting from the kitchen. The music itself really is the true heart of the whole evening. A skilled piano player sets up in one corner of the room and pounds out a driving, rollicking style perfectly suited to filling a crowded space with real energy, and the whole apartment starts to move together as one. This particular era turns out, quite unexpectedly, to be something of a golden age for exactly this kind of music, and the informal, cash-strapped rent party becomes an entirely unlikely proving ground for it. Genuinely talented musicians work these regular parties for whatever tips they can collect, and a hot plate of food, quietly hunting their craft night after night in the tight, crowded quarters of these packed apartments. And some of the very finest musicians of the entire era cut their teeth doing exactly this kind of work. The playing itself continues on late into the night without any real sign of stopping. The dancers keep the cleared floor moving constantly, and for a few precious hours, the troubles waiting patiently outside the front door get drowned out completely by the music and the noise. And that drowning out is honestly at least half the real point of the whole evening, if not more. Yes, the party is meant, first and foremost, to raise the rent money, and everyone attending genuinely hopes it succeeds in doing exactly that. But it's also, quite plainly, a genuine release valve, a real chance to shake off the grinding daily weight of these hard times and simply feel properly alive again for one evening, surrounded by neighbors and close friends. People who spend their days standing patiently in soup lines and dodging the Repossession Man's truck genuinely need somewhere to laugh, to dance, to flirt a little, to joke around, and simply forget their troubles for a while. The rent party provides exactly that outlet, transforming one family's private crisis into a shared neighborhood celebration, and quietly reminding everyone present that they are not, in fact, suffering through all of this entirely alone. By the time the very last guest finally stumbles home in the small hours of the morning, you sit down and count the coins collected in the jar, and with a bit of genuine luck, you find enough there to satisfy the landlord for another month. Even if the total collected falls just a little short of what's needed, you've still gained something that no amount of money could ever quite measure properly. A full night of real joy, and the quiet, comforting knowledge that your neighbors genuinely turned out for you when it truly mattered. This same spirit of pulling together as a community shows up in 100 different forms throughout these particular years, but survival, unfortunately, doesn't always come wrapped up quite so pleasantly as a party. Sometimes it means picking carefully through whatever other people have already thrown away entirely. Let's follow the truly hungry tonight out to the very edge of town. Hunger, it turns out, has a genuine way of quietly rewriting your own personal standards over time. And tonight, that same hunger leads you all the way out to the city dump on the edge of town. You quickly discover, very far from alone out here. Whole families are picking carefully through the scattered piles, searching methodically for anything the local restaurants and grocers might have thrown out that still looks reasonably safe to eat. A slightly bruised vegetable here. A bone with a little usable meat still clinging to it there. A loaf of bread just barely past its prime sitting near the top of a pile. In some cities, the truly desperate wait patiently near the back doors of local markets, specifically for the day's spoiled produce to be set out, or else they quietly trail the garbage trucks all the way to their final destination. It is genuinely grim and genuinely dangerous work, and people do sometimes get sick from doing it regularly. But the only real alternative on offer is an empty cooking pot sitting on the stove at home. You tell yourself quietly that this is only for right now, only until things eventually turn around for your family, and you keep on searching carefully through the piles as the evening light slowly fades around you. The genuinely cruelest part of the whole situation is that the food itself really is out there somewhere, in real quantity. In a country where so very many people are going hungry this particular year, there is, at the very same time, a steady, constant stream of perfectly edible food being discarded daily, thrown out routinely by restaurants at the close of business each night, tossed aside by grocers the moment their produce starts visibly turning, cleared out of markets and home kitchens as a matter of simple, everyday routine. The hunger defining these years isn't always, strictly speaking, a hunger born of true scarcity. It's very often a hunger born instead of badly broken distribution, of food and hungry people simply unable to reach one another anymore through the ordinary channels of steady money and steady work. So the hungry go looking directly for the food wherever it actually ends up discarded, and where it ends up, more often than not, is precisely the city dump, the back alley, or the rear entrance of the local market. Picking carefully through these discarded piles turns out to be genuinely careful, practiced work in its own right. You learn over time exactly what's still worth taking home and what's already too far gone to bother with. How to properly spot a vegetable that's merely bruised rather than genuinely rotten straight through. A bone that still carries a reasonable amount of usable meat clinging to it. A loaf of bread that's simply gone stale rather than properly spoiled beyond saving. You bring along a sturdy sack or a woven basket and move through the piles methodically, competing quietly with other families doing exactly the same careful search alongside you. There's very little conversation exchanged out here, and even less direct eye contact between the searchers, because everyone present shares precisely the same reduced circumstances, and nobody particularly wants to dwell openly on that shared fact. The overall goal is simply to gather together enough scattered food to make one proper meal, then slip quietly away and turn the day's careful salvage into something resembling supper back home for the family. Some families, over time, develop a considerably more efficient system for the whole process. Rather than waiting patiently for discarded food to eventually make its way all the way out to the dump, they position themselves instead directly at the source, lingering quietly near the back doors of local restaurants and markets, exactly where the day's discards first tend to appear. When a grocer finally sets out a crate of produce that's simply gone too far to sell, or a restaurant kitchen empties out its evening scraps into a bin, the waiting families move in quickly and quietly. Others learn the regular routes the local garbage trucks follow through town, and simply follow along behind them, meeting the day's fresh refuse right at its final destination, well before the flies and the worst of the rot have properly claimed it. It amounts to an entire informal, unofficial economy of leftovers, organized quietly around simple hunger and hidden carefully away from the comfortable eyes of those who still manage to eat reasonably well. The dangers involved in all this are genuinely real and genuinely serious. Make no mistake about that. Discarded food gets discarded for actual reasons in the first place, and spoilage really can make a person seriously, dangerously ill if they're not careful about what they choose to bring home. Eating what other people have already thrown away amounts to a genuine gamble with your own family's health. And people do, unfortunately, lose that particular gamble from time to time, sickened badly by food their bodies simply should never have been asked to accept in the first place. But hunger turns out to be a genuinely relentless negotiator, and it wears down anyone's natural caution, day after day after day. When your own children haven't eaten properly in far too long, and the kitchen cupboard sits completely bare, the risk of one bad meal starts to look, quite honestly, a great deal better than the absolute certainty of no meal at all that night. You choose, in the end, the danger you can actually do something about, over the hunger you genuinely cannot escape no matter what. You carry your salvaged supper home carefully and make of it whatever you reasonably can, telling yourself, just as everyone else out here quietly tells themselves too, that this is only temporary, just a low point your family will eventually climb back out of once things properly improve again. It's a genuinely hard thing to openly admit to, this particular kind of scavenging, and most people who actually do it never really speak of it afterward, not even to close family. And yet, even here, in what is genuinely one of the bleakest corners of this whole difficult decade, the basic impulse to share with others somehow survives intact, and neighbors still manage to find real ways to stretch what little they collectively have across more hungry mouths than would otherwise seem possible. Sometimes that particular spirit of sharing takes on the strangest, and honestly the most quietly touching, forms imaginable. Let's follow a single ham bone tonight, as it slowly makes its way down the entire length of the block. There is a single ham bone making its slow, steady way around the entire neighborhood this week, and tonight happens to be your particular turn to have it in your own kitchen. You drop it carefully into your simmering pot of beans, let it cook slowly through the evening, and coax out whatever faint remaining flavor of real meat still clings stubbornly to the bone, giving your own family a supper that tastes, for one single night, a little like better days gone by. Then you rinse it off carefully under the tap and pass it along to the next house down the street, who will do precisely the same thing themselves tomorrow evening. It amounts to sharing stretched right out to its absolute practical limit, a small, genuinely edible little miracle circulating quietly hand to hand down the entire length of the block. Nobody around here finds the practice the least bit strange. In a decade genuinely this lean, a simple leftover scrap of bone becomes a real, shared community resource. And basic generosity gets measured out carefully in whatever thin broth you can manage to pass along to the next family in line. Real meat has become a genuinely rare luxury throughout these particular years. So an actual ham bone, still carrying real lingering traces of fat and flavor within it, is a treasure far too valuable to properly belong to just one single household alone. Whoever happens to be lucky enough to come by an actual ham eats the meat itself, naturally enough, but the bone that remains afterward still holds enormous practical value, fully capable of transforming an otherwise plain pot of beans into something considerably richer and more satisfying. Rather than let all that borrowed richness simply go to waste on one single family, the whole neighborhood works out a practical arrangement that is every bit as generous as it is sensible. The bone itself will make the rounds, spending exactly one full day in each house along the block, lending its rich flavor to one family's cooking pot before quietly moving along to the very next one in line. The way it actually works in your own kitchen tonight is really quite simple. When the bone finally arrives at your door, you set your own pot of beans to cooking right away and drop the bone in carefully. And as the pot slowly simmers away on the stove, the bone steadily gives up its small remaining gift. A little fat gradually melts into the broth. A little real flavor slowly seeps out from the marrow inside. And the humble beans themselves take on a real depth and heartiness that they could genuinely never have managed entirely on their own. Your family sits down together that evening to a proper supper that carries the distinct ghost of real meat running through it. And for one single evening, the whole meal feels genuinely generous, almost indulgent by comparison to most nights. There is real comfort built into it, and not only the plain nourishment itself, but also the taste of something distinctly better than usual, a quiet reminder of the fuller tables everyone still remembers fondly and genuinely hopes to see again someday soon. Then, once your own family has finished eating for the night, you don't keep the bone for yourself, and you certainly don't simply throw it away either. You rinse it off carefully under the tap and carry it next door yourself, handing it along personally to the family whose turn comes next in the rotation. They will do exactly as you did tonight, coaxing one more full meal's worth of flavor out of the bone before passing it along themselves to the house after theirs. And so the bone continues its steady journey, house to house, pot to pot, giving up its small gift a little at a time to family after family down the block, until at last there is genuinely nothing left inside it to give, and it is finally, respectfully, set aside for good. A single bone like this might realistically feed a full dozen separate households before it's finally spent completely. Its whole quiet journey amounting to a small, moving map of an entire block's collective kindness toward one another. What makes the whole practice so genuinely remarkable is really just how completely ordinary it seems to absolutely everyone directly involved in it. Nobody around here treats the traveling ham bone as any kind of curiosity, or as something to feel ashamed about doing. It is simply, quite plainly, how things are done now around here, a sensible, practical response to genuinely hard times, an entirely unspoken community agreement that in lean days like these, you stretch every single scrap of food as far as it will possibly go, and then you share that stretching openly and generously with your neighbors besides. There is genuine dignity built into the whole practice, and real warmth too, a quiet, collective refusal to let hard times harden anyone into simply hoarding what little they happen to have left for themselves. The bone itself becomes, in its own small way, a genuine symbol of everything still quietly holding this particular community together through the worst of it. So you pass the bone along to your neighbor tonight and think very little more of it. And tomorrow, perhaps, that same neighbor will pass something back to you in return, a cup of borrowed flour, a handful of fresh vegetables from someone's small garden, a genuine favor exactly when you happen to need one most. This, in the end, really is how people manage to survive these years, by carefully weaving their own meager individual resources together into something sturdy enough to carry the whole community forward at once. And eventually, out of this whole world built on shared ham bones and rent parties and thin, watery soup, a genuinely new kind of help finally starts to arrive from an unexpected direction. One that comes, this time, not from your immediate neighbors, but directly from your own federal government, arriving wrapped up in a whole confusing jumble of unfamiliar letters. Let's go find some honest work together with the alphabet. Real relief finally starts arriving this year, and it comes wearing a whole confusing jumble of unfamiliar letters. There's one new agency sending young men off to plant trees and build public parks together, while faithfully mailing most of their modest pay directly back home to their waiting families each month. There's another, larger agency putting people to work paving new roads, raising fresh school buildings, and remarkably, even hearing professional artists, working writers, and trained musicians to help keep the country's collective spirit properly alive through the hardship. People around town start calling the whole thing alphabet soup, this seemingly endless stream of brand new government agencies popping up one after another. And for the first time in what feels like years now, there is finally a real paycheck attached directly to honest, dignified labor once again. It isn't charity, and that particular distinction matters enormously to a genuinely proud worker who has been struggling for years. You pick up a shovel, or perhaps a paintbrush instead, and you feel, cautiously at first, like a person with real purpose again. For years now, whatever help genuinely existed came mostly from local charities, from concerned neighbors, and from scattered, small-scale local efforts here and there, never nearly enough on their own to meet a need spreading this genuinely wide across the whole country. Then the federal government finally steps in, on a scale the country has genuinely never witnessed before, creating one new agency after another specifically to put the country's jobless back to honest work. And each new agency quickly becomes known by its own set of initials, until the entire combined effort starts to sound, quite literally, like a whole bowl of alphabet soup simmering away. The core idea driving all of it is genuinely important to understand properly. Rather than simply handing out relief payments directly, which tends to wound the natural pride of people who have always worked honestly for their own bread, these new programs instead offer real jobs, genuine work for genuine wages, carefully preserving both the paycheck itself and the basic human dignity that comes along naturally with actually earning it yourself. One particular program takes young men from struggling families and sends them out together into the countryside to work directly on the land itself. They plant enormous numbers of new trees, fight hard against soil erosion, and build hiking trails, public parks, and campgrounds, generally working to repair some of the real damage already done to the natural world, all while learning valuable practical skills and real discipline along the way. They live together in organized camps, eat regular, decent meals each day, and crucially, most of their modest monthly pay gets sent directly back home to their struggling families waiting there. For a young man who might otherwise be drifting aimlessly and going hungry, the program means real purpose, real structure, and the genuine, deep satisfaction of properly supporting the people he loves most. For his family back home, it means a small but genuinely reliable stream of real money arriving each month during a time when money itself has all but disappeared entirely from most households. The largest and most sprawling of these various programs reaches into nearly every single corner of the country and puts an astonishing, genuinely surprising variety of different people back to honest work. There are the obvious jobs one might expect: men out paving new roads, building sturdy bridges, and raising new schoolhouses and post offices and public buildings that will realistically go on standing for generations to come. But there is also something genuinely remarkable and unexpected happening alongside all of that practical construction work. The program itself openly recognizes that a country amounts to a great deal more than simply its roads and its public buildings alone. And so it also goes out and hires professional artists to paint public murals, working writers to properly record local histories and useful guidebooks, trained actors to stage full public plays, and skilled musicians to perform regularly for the public. The underlying reasoning here is that these particular people are genuine workers too, that their specialized skills genuinely carry real value, and that a nation actively fighting off widespread despair needs its collective spirit properly fed and nourished, right alongside its stomach. The real difference all of this combined makes is genuinely hard to properly overstate when you stop to consider it. A regular paycheck arriving each week, however modest the actual amount, changes absolutely everything for a family that has spent the last several years scraping by on nothing but thin soup and careful, desperate salvage. It means the monthly rent can finally get paid on time again. It means real food that can actually get properly bought at the market, rather than scavenged from behind it. It means new shoes finally for the growing children. A small, genuine measure of real stability, after years spent in an absolute free fall with no bottom in sight. And it means something a good deal less tangible too, but every bit as vital to a person's basic well-being: the slow, quiet return of real self-respect. A person who has spent years feeling genuinely idle and dependent on others, who has felt increasingly useless and quietly ashamed of that fact, can finally stand up straight again as a proper worker, contributing something real, building something lasting, genuinely part of something considerably larger than merely their own individual survival. That particular restoration of real pride turns out to be its own powerful kind of medicine for a struggling nation. These various programs certainly don't manage to end the hard times overnight, not by any measure, and plenty of genuine struggle still very much remains for families across the country. But they do mark a real, meaningful turning point, a growing sense that the country is finally starting to fight back properly on behalf of its own ordinary people, rather than simply watching them struggle alone. You take up your own shovel, or perhaps your paintbrush instead, and you genuinely feel the difference settle in your own chest, the quiet, welcome return of real purpose after years without it. Still, for a great many families across the country, no local job on offer proves quite enough on its own, and the powerful pull of a distant promise elsewhere proves considerably stronger, in the end, than the simple comfort of staying put where you are. Out west, people keep saying, there is real work waiting and real warmth, and entire fields heavy with ripe fruit just waiting patiently to be picked. So you load up the family truck and point it directly toward the setting sun. Let's head west for California together tonight. The family farm is gone now, sold off or simply abandoned to the drifting dust, and the land itself has turned to nothing but fine, dry powder blowing across what used to be your fields. There is genuinely nothing left here worth staying for anymore. So you load absolutely everything your family still owns onto a wheezing, overloaded old truck, and you point the whole rattling contraption west, toward California. Out there, people keep saying, there is real work waiting, real sunshine, and entire fields heavy with ripe fruit just waiting patiently to be picked by anyone willing to do the labor. You, and thousands of other families exactly like yours, crawl slowly along the same highway together in one great, sprawling, slow-moving migration. Mattresses lashed tightly to the roof. Children wedged carefully between crates and bundles in the truck bed. Radiators boiling over repeatedly in the punishing desert heat. The whole journey stretches on for what feels like forever, and the truck itself is held together with little more than baling wire and quiet, constant prayer. You genuinely don't know exactly what's waiting for your family at the far end of this road, but you know with real certainty that it simply cannot be any worse than the empty, blowing fields you're leaving behind you. So you drive on, mile after mile. The decision to leave home was never made lightly, not for a single family among the thousands making this same journey. But by the time any of them actually reach the point of loading up their truck, staying behind has become genuinely impossible to sustain any longer. The dust storms have buried entire fields under drifted soil. The relentless drought has killed off whatever crops managed to survive the storms. The bank has already taken, or is actively in the process of taking, the family land itself. And there is simply no real future left anymore in the place your family has called home for generations. Word arrives, carried along on printed handbills and second-hand rumors, of a genuine promised land out west, California, with its warm, reliable climate, its endless rows of fruit orchards, and its supposed constant hunger for willing workers to help bring in the harvest each season. It sounds, to ears grown desperate enough, very much like real salvation. And when a family has genuinely nothing left to lose at home, salvation starts to feel worth chasing across half a continent, no matter the cost or the risk involved. Loading the truck itself becomes a genuine exercise in painful, careful arithmetic. Everything your family still owns somehow has to fit into a space far too small for all of it, and the old truck itself is small and worn, and already straining badly under far less weight than this. You lash the mattresses tightly to the roof, pile the remaining furniture and cooking pots and bundled clothing wherever they'll physically fit, and tuck the smaller children carefully into whatever gaps remain between the packed crates. Whatever genuinely won't fit gets either left behind entirely, or sold off for whatever few pennies it can still bring in. One more small piece of your family's former life quietly abandoned by the roadside. Then the whole overloaded contraption sags visibly down on its worn tires, coughs reluctantly to life, and lurches slowly out onto the open highway, joining a long, steady procession of other families making this exact same desperate journey west that same week. The road itself proves to be a genuine trial in its own right. The distances involved are simply enormous, stretching across state after state. The truck itself is thoroughly unreliable, and the money available for fuel and repairs is close to non-existent for most families making the trip. Radiators boil over repeatedly out in the brutal desert heat. Tires blow without warning on the rough roads. Tired engines strain and sputter along, threatening to give out completely at any moment. And each individual breakdown becomes its own small roadside crisis that somehow has to get solved, using nothing but raw ingenuity and whatever spare parts can be scavenged, borrowed, or quietly begged from a passing stranger. Families camp together by the roadside each night, cooking over small open fires, carefully rationing out their scant remaining food and water supplies. Children grow steadily more restless and hungry as the days wear on. Tempers fray under the strain. And still the road stretches on ahead, mile after endless mile, the promised land always sitting just beyond the next horizon. It is slow, genuinely grinding, deeply uncertain travel, endured only because the alternative left behind was so plainly, obviously worse. Along the way, you meet countless other families making this exact same pilgrimage west, and there is real comfort to be found in that shared struggle, a genuine sense of belonging to one vast, moving community of the displaced, all heading in the same direction together. You swap useful information with other traveling families about which particular roads are actually passable, where clean water can reliably be found along the route, which towns still welcome traveling strangers, and which ones turn them away at the edge of town. You help each other with roadside breakdowns as they happen, and share what little food anyone still has left at the evening roadside camps. But there is also a growing, quiet unease beginning to spread through the traveling community, whispered warnings passed along by families already heading back the other way, suggesting that California might not turn out to be the genuine paradise the printed handbills had originally promised, that there are already far more workers out there than actual available jobs, and that the welcome waiting at the far end might prove considerably colder than expected. You push those particular doubts aside for now and keep driving anyway, because by this point your family has already burned every bridge behind it. At last, after days and days on the road, the long journey finally ends, and California itself comes into view ahead, green and warm, and genuinely beautiful to eyes worn out from weeks of dust and hardship. And for one brief, hopeful moment, the whole promise feels entirely real. But the actual reality waiting there on the ground proves a great deal harder than the dream that originally drew your family across the desert. And the discovery of exactly how hard it really is comes quickly, within the very first few days. The orchards are genuinely there, exactly as promised, heavy with real fruit ready for picking. But so, unfortunately, are several thousand other families, all exactly like yours, all chasing after precisely the same limited number of available jobs. Let's step together into the migrant labor camp now, and see firsthand what this particular promised land actually turns out to hold in store. You have finally made it all the way to California. And it turns out this particular paradise had some very different plans in mind for your family than the ones you've been hopping for. There are, by any honest measure, a great many more available workers here than there are actual jobs to fill. Wages have already been driven down to almost nothing at all by the sheer overwhelming competition. And the local residents in these farming towns do not exactly greet newly arriving families like yours with any real warmth or open arms. You settle your family into a rough, makeshift camp set up along an irrigation ditch on the edge of town, a cluster of canvas tents and improvised shacks that looks, uncomfortably, very much like the exact shantytown your family thought it had left behind for good back home. The actual work available, once you finally do manage to find some, turns out to be genuinely backbreaking stoop labor, carried out under a punishing sun, picking crops for a wage measured out in mere pennies per full basket collected. Some government-run camps in the area do offer somewhat cleaner conditions and a bit of real, restored dignity, and those particular camps feel, by comparison, like genuine small kingdoms to families who have known nothing better in months. Mostly, though, your family finds itself chasing the harvest from one field to the next, one crop after another, always moving on, always hopping quietly that the next valley over will finally pay a little bit better than the last one did. The genuinely cruel underlying mathematics of the whole situation become clear to your family almost immediately upon arrival. The handbills that originally lured so many desperate families west were deliberately designed to draw in far more available workers than the surrounding fields could ever realistically employ at once, because a steady flood of thoroughly desperate laborers means the local growers can afford to pay out as little as possible for each basket picked. With literally hundreds of families competing directly for every single available picking job, wages collapse down to a level barely worth the physical effort involved, and the entire family, children included, has to work together in the fields just to earn enough money for that day's food. The promised abundance really is genuinely real. The orchards truly are heavy with ripe fruit as far as the eye can see. But that particular abundance plainly belongs to the growers themselves, not to the exhausted pickers who actually bring the whole harvest in for mere pennies a basket. Your family crossed an entire continent chasing after a fair wage that, as it turns out, simply doesn't exist here at all. The actual living conditions waiting for your family dash the original dream even further still. Instead of the comfortable new life everyone had imagined back home, your family finds itself instead in a rough squatter camp thrown together hastily along a drainage ditch or a stretch of roadside, a miserable, crowded jumble of canvas tents, improvised shacks, and converted truck beds housing other families just as broke and thoroughly worn out as your own. There is very little genuinely clean water available anywhere in the camp, no real sanitation facilities to speak of at all, and disease spreads easily and quickly through such crowded, filthy living conditions. It looks, you realize with a genuine sinking feeling in your chest, exactly like the very same shantytown your family originally fled from back home, only now sitting a great deal further from anywhere familiar, and stripped even of the thin comfort that came from at least standing on familiar ground. Your family has traveled some 2,000 miles altogether, only to arrive right back at essentially the same starting point, minus absolutely everything you originally spent along the way just getting here. The reception from the local residents stings your family almost as much as the plain poverty itself does. Rather than any real welcome, your family instead encounters open suspicion and outright contempt from the surrounding community. Treated openly as unwanted invaders, as a genuine drain and a persistent nuisance, lumped together indiscriminately with every other recently arrived family under dismissive local nicknames that sting every time you hear them. Signs posted around the nearby town make it entirely, plainly clear that your family is not particularly welcome here, and the underlying resentment runs open and cold throughout the whole community. It is a genuinely bewildering thing for your family to have traveled this far in honest search of real work and basic dignity, only to find yourselves openly despised instead for the very poverty that originally drove you here in desperation. You keep your head down, do the work available to you each day, and try your best to shield the children from the very worst of the open scorn, but it genuinely wears down the spirit over time, week after difficult week. The actual work itself proves punishing beyond easy description. Picking crops day after day means long hours spent bent double under a genuinely relentless sun, hands quickly growing raw and blistered, backs aching constantly, moving steadily down endless rows of plants for a wage measured out in mere pennies per basket filled. And the work itself is never remotely steady or reliable. The moment one particular crop finishes its harvest, the available work simply vanishes overnight, and your family has to pack everything back up quickly and chase after the next ripening harvest in the next valley over, following the shifting seasons and the ripening fields from one place to the next, over and over. There is no real rest built into this life, no chance to properly put down roots anywhere, no genuine security to be found at all. Only the constant, grinding movement from one backbreaking, poorly paid job straight into the next one, always hopping quietly that the next stop down the road might prove just slightly kinder than the last one turned out to be. There are occasional bright spots scattered through it all, rare and genuinely precious when your family does happen to find one. Some of the government-run camps in the area do manage to offer clean water, decent sanitation facilities, and a real measure of order and restored dignity for the family staying there. And to a family that has known nothing recently but roadside ditches and crowded squatter settlements, a camp like that can feel, by comparison, like an actual small kingdom worth treasuring. But there are simply too few such camps available to hold every family that genuinely needs one. So mostly, your family makes do with whatever accommodations are actually available and simply keeps moving on when the work runs out. Through absolutely all of it, though, one particular thing keeps your family going forward regardless. A habit so deeply ingrained by now that it has become something close to a genuine, quiet devotion in its own right. The absolute, total refusal to ever waste a single useful thing. That relentless, hard-won thrift turns out to be the invisible engine driving every single survival story to come out of these particular years. Let's look now together at this quiet religion of simply making do with what little you have. Somewhere along the way through these particular years, ordinary household thrift stops being merely a sensible habit and gradually becomes something closer to genuine devotion instead. An old family saying comes to rule every single household you visit. Use it up completely. Wear it out entirely. Make it do somehow, or else simply learn to do without it altogether. Nothing in your household is ever considered truly finished with its useful life. Worn-out shirts get turned carefully into patches. Those same patches eventually become quilt squares, and the finished quilts themselves get mended and remended for years on end, until barely a single scrap of the original fabric actually remains anywhere in the piece. Bacon grease gets carefully saved in an old tin can for future cooking. Loose string gets carefully wound up into a slowly growing ball for later use. Bent nails get hammered patiently straight again for a genuine second useful life. Children growing up in households like yours are taught from an early age that throwing anything away at all amounts to something very close to a genuine sin, and that particular lesson stays with them, quietly, for the entire rest of their lives, long after these hard years have finally passed. Your own home becomes, in its own quiet way, a genuine masterclass in stretching every single object as far as it can possibly go, and then finding some way to stretch it just a little bit further still after that. The underlying philosophy gets captured perfectly in that simple four-part family motto, repeated so often around your household that it eventually becomes almost automatic, requiring no real conscious thought at all. First, you use a given thing up completely, wringing out every last bit of practical value it has to offer. When it can no longer properly serve its original intended purpose, you wear it out further still in some lesser secondary role instead. When even that reduced role is finally exhausted too, you somehow make it do regardless, finding yet another creative use for whatever small remnant still remains. And only when there is genuinely nothing left at all to extract from it do you finally, reluctantly, do without it altogether. It amounts to a whole way of thinking that treats every single object in the household, however humble or ordinary it might seem, as something genuinely precious in its own right. And this particular philosophy quietly governs nearly every decision made in your household, from the kitchen, to the sewing basket, to the small tool shed out back. Nothing illustrates this particular philosophy more clearly than the full life cycle of an ordinary shirt passing through your household. A shirt gets worn steadily until it eventually starts to fray at the seams, then gets carefully patched and worn some more after that. When it finally becomes too far gone to patch properly anymore, the remaining good fabric gets carefully cut away and saved separately, eventually becoming patches for other garments in the household, or individual squares destined for a growing family quilt. Worn-out clothing, old flour sacks, and every other scrap of genuinely usable cloth eventually get pieced together carefully into a warm, patchwork family quilt. And even those finished quilts get mended and remended for years afterward, layer building steadily upon layer, until the finished quilt is really more repair work at this point than original fabric. Cloth, quite simply, never really dies for good in a household like yours during these years. It gets transformed again and again instead, moving steadily down a whole ladder of decreasing uses, until it finally becomes nothing more than a simple cleaning rag. And only then, at the very last, is it truly, finally used up completely. The kitchen in your household follows this exact same relentless underlying logic. Bacon grease never simply gets poured away down the drain, but instead gets carefully saved in a tin can kept right by the stove, used again and again for frying and for flavoring other dishes, a genuinely precious cooking fat that it would be sheer madness to waste needlessly. Bones travel steadily around the whole neighborhood, exactly as we've already seen, giving up their remaining flavor to pot after pot along the way. Stale bread gets transformed carefully into a proper pudding, or into breadcrumbs, or used simply as a thickener for the next pot of soup. Vegetable scraps go straight into the stock pot rather than into the trash. Leftovers get creatively reinvented again and again throughout the week, last night's supper becoming today's lunch wearing an entirely new disguise. Every single edible thing in your household gets carefully coaxed to yield its full remaining value, And the very idea of simply scraping good food straight into the trash bin has become, by this point, something close to unthinkable in your family. Beyond simple cloth and food, this same careful habit extends out to cover every single object sitting anywhere in your home. String never gets discarded, but instead gets carefully wound onto an ever-growing ball, saved patiently for the eventual day it will genuinely be needed for something. Bent nails get carefully straightened again with a hammer and reused without a second thought. Jars, tin cans, cardboard boxes, and containers of every conceivable kind get kept around and repurposed for some new use. Broken household items get carefully repaired rather than simply replaced outright, mended patiently with scraps of wire, a bit of glue, and no small amount of pure household ingenuity. Because replacing anything outright costs real money, and real money, quite simply, does not currently exist in your household budget. Your home becomes, in its own quiet way, a place where almost nothing is ever truly thrown away for good, where every single item lingers on through use after use after use, carefully saved against the ever-present possibility of some future need arising down the road. The deepest mark left by all of this in the end is left not really on the household objects themselves, but on the people living among them, and especially on the children growing up surrounded by it all. Growing up in a world where genuine waste is treated as something close to sinful shapes these children permanently, instilling in them a level of frugality so profound that it lasts on through the entire rest of their lives, long after these particular hard years have finally passed into memory and real plenty has, in time, actually returned. They will go on saving string and carefully rinsing out used aluminum foil, and cleaning their dinner plates completely, for decades still to come, entirely unable to shake loose the deep lesson carved so thoroughly into them during these lean, difficult years. It stands today as one of this whole era's most lasting legacies, this genuinely bone-deep sense of thrift. And when the long day of careful making-do is finally, fully done for the evening, your family gathers together around the one household possession that seems to give freely without ever being fully used up itself, the warmly glowing wooden box sitting quietly in the corner of the room, the one that carries real voices and real music and a little genuine hope straight into your household each night. Let's turn the dial together, one final time tonight. When the sun finally goes down each evening, and there is genuinely no spare money left over for anything else, your whole family gathers together around the one glowing treasure still sitting in the house, the radio. For free, it fills the entire room with music, with comedy, with thrilling adventure serials, and with familiar voices that make even this small, crowded space feel a little less lonely than it otherwise would. And on certain special evenings, the president himself speaks directly to your family through that same little speaker, in a calm, steady, reassuring tone, explaining the country's ongoing troubles almost as though he were sitting right there with you in your own living room. People have taken to calling these particular broadcasts fireside chats, and for a whole nation running dangerously low on genuine hope, that steady, familiar voice becomes something very close to real medicine for the spirit. You lean in a little closer, the whole family falling quiet together, the glowing dial warm in the darkened room, and for a little while at least, it genuinely feels like someone out there truly believes things might actually get better before too long. The radio turns out to be the perfect companion for genuinely hard times precisely because, once your family actually owns one, the entertainment it provides afterward costs absolutely nothing at all. There are no tickets to purchase, no admission fee required at the door, only the modest cost of electricity and the simple patience to sit quietly and listen for a while. In an era where every single penny gets carefully counted, and every small amusement gets weighed carefully against the competing price of food on the table, this free, seemingly endless flow of programming amounts to a genuine gift for families like yours. The whole family can gather round it together, night after night, receiving music and stories and real laughter without spending a single cent in the process. And in a decade defined so thoroughly by scarcity in every direction, that particular abundance of genuinely free entertainment amounts to a comfort well beyond ordinary measure. And what pours steadily out of that small speaker each evening amounts to an entire world unto itself. There is music of every conceivable kind, filling your small, crowded room with sounds that genuinely lift the spirit and set tired feet tapping along despite themselves. There are talented comedians whose familiar jokes and recurring characters become something close to beloved household companions, eagerly awaited each and every week, and quoted enthusiastically around the dinner table for days afterward. There are ongoing dramatic serials and thrilling adventure stories that unfold gradually, episode by episode, leaving families genuinely sitting on the edge of their seats, desperate to find out exactly what happens next in the story. The radio brings genuine variety, real escape, and honest wonder into homes that otherwise have precious little of any of those three things to offer. And the familiar characters and voices coming through that speaker eventually become almost as familiar and beloved as actual members of your own family. Then there are those particular special evenings when the president himself takes to the public airwaves specifically to speak directly to the whole listening nation at once. His particular approach to these broadcasts is genuinely unusual for the era and remarkably effective as a result. Rather than lecturing down from some distant position of authority, he speaks instead in a warm, plain, thoroughly conversational tone, almost as though he has personally pulled up a chair right there in your own living room specifically to explain the current situation directly to you and your family. He addresses the country's very real troubles honestly, but calmly and steadily, laying out clearly what concrete steps are actually being taken and explaining carefully why. And he manages to do all of this using plain, everyday language that ordinary people can genuinely follow and understand. The overall effect on listeners proves genuinely remarkable. People across the country feel as though they are being spoken to directly, as individual human beings, reassured by one steady, familiar voice that seems to genuinely grasp their own personal fears and appears to be working actively on their behalf. These particular fireside chats become something the entire country starts eagerly waiting for together, gathering as families to listen closely each time one is announced. Families across the whole country draw in close around their own radios during these broadcasts, sitting quiet and fully attentive. And at the very same moment, millions of other families scattered across the entire country are doing exactly the same thing simultaneously, all listening together to that same calm, steady voice coming through their speakers. There is a genuinely strange intimacy built into the whole experience, this real sense of a national leader speaking personally and directly to each individual Fright household at once. And there is real unity too, found simply in knowing that everyone else out there happens to be listening in at that exact same moment as well. For a nation genuinely battered by years of accumulated fear and hardship, that particular kind of reassurance matters enormously more than it might otherwise seem to. It restores a real measure of lost confidence, a growing belief that the country is actually being steered forward by someone who genuinely cares about ordinary people, and who actually has a real plan for moving things forward. So in the deepening darkness of the evening, with the day's struggles finally set aside for a while, and the small radio dial glowing warmly in the room, your family leans in together and listens closely. And for a little while at least, the accumulated loneliness and worry of these hard years genuinely lift away. Whether it happens to be a comedian's familiar joke, a dramatic serial's latest cliffhanger, a favorite song coming through clearly, or simply the president's own steady, reassuring voice, the radio gives freely of real comfort and genuine hope each and every evening. And hope, as it turns out, remains the single scarcest resource of all throughout these particular years. You sit together quietly in that warm, glowing light, and you let yourself believe, just a little bit, that these hard times surely cannot last forever, that genuinely better days are still coming eventually, and that your whole family will still be here together to see them arrive when they finally do. So there you have it, one single long stretch of ordinary days pulled from somewhere deep in the 1930s. And what a genuinely punishing stretch of days it truly was. You woke that morning inside a shack built from tin and cardboard scraps, stood patiently in the bread line long before dawn broke, and rode the rattling freight rails through the cold darkness, searching for work that never quite seemed to actually appear. You watched the open sky itself turn black with the very soil that had once faithfully fed your family, watched an entire lifetime of careful savings simply vanish behind a bank's suddenly locked front doors, and watched the repossession man carry your family's comfortable past out to his waiting truck, one single piece at a time. You ate the thin, watery stew night after night, wore the flour sack dress to church on Sunday, passed the shared ham bone carefully down the block, and picked patiently through the city dump when there was genuinely nothing else left to eat. And somehow, through absolutely all of it, your family simply kept going forward regardless. That particular part is genuinely worth holding onto tonight, more than anything else in this whole long story. These were never extraordinary people to begin with, not in any special sense. They were simply ordinary folks, farmers and store clerks and tired mothers and frightened children, handed an entire decade of accumulated loss they never once asked for and never remotely deserved. And still, somehow, they made mock apple pie out of nothing more than crushed crackers, specifically to give their own children one small taste of real sweetness. Still, they threw their rent parties together and danced through the night regardless. Still, they carried a struggling neighbor's furniture right back up the stairs after an eviction, and gathered together quietly around the radio each evening to believe, just a little, in genuinely better days still somewhere ahead. They stretched every single scrap of what little they had, shared every last bone down the length of the block, and flatly refused to let these hard times ever harden them into something small and mean-spirited. So tonight, as you settle comfortably into your own warm bed, inside your own properly heated home, with a full pantry sitting just a few steps away, maybe take just a moment to whisper a quiet word of thanks to all the ones who came before you and lived through exactly this. They endured the choking dust, and the gnawing hunger, and the grinding daily uncertainty, precisely so that ordinary comfort could eventually become something you barely even have to think about anymore in your own life. History, as this particular story makes plain, can genuinely be bleak and deeply unfair and honestly heartbreaking in equal measure. But it also stands as real, lasting proof that ordinary people are fundamentally stubborn and quietly generous and remarkably, unbreakably resilient underneath it all, even when everything around them seems determined to prove otherwise. Rest easy now, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. You have genuinely earned it.